A woman stood in the middle of a collapsing trauma bay with blood on her gloves and a dying soldier's dog at her feet, and the most powerful doctor in the building pointed at her and said, "Get out." She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She pressed one hand against the animal's wound and kept working like he hadn't spoken at all. That moment, caught on 3 hospital security cameras, would eventually cost a man his career, his license, and his freedom. But on that Tuesday night in Harlow Falls, West Virginia, nobody in Harlow General Medical Center knew any of that yet. They just knew her name was Claire Navarro, and she was just a nurse. Before we go any further, if you're watching this and you've never seen this channel before, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because the stories we tell here don't go where you expect them to go. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that Tuesday night, and let's start from the very beginning. The rain that hit Harlow Falls that evening didn't arrive the way rain usually does. It didn't build. There was no warning drizzle, no gradual darkening of the afternoon sky. One moment it was overcast and still, and the next the sky opened and dropped a wall of water across the city that turned the streets outside Harlow General into shallow rivers and sent ambulance crews sliding through standing puddles on the loading dock. Claire Navarro noticed the rain the way she noticed most things, briefly, clinically, filed away and set aside. She was already inside, already in the middle of a 12-hour shift that had started at 6 in the morning and showed no interest in slowing down. She was 41 years old, and she had the kind of face that didn't give much away. Not cold, exactly, but settled. Certain. The kind of expression that comes from having been in rooms where composure wasn't optional. She worked the emergency department's trauma wing, which at Harlow General meant a long corridor of curtained bays, overhead fluorescents that buzzed faintly when the building's HVAC system cycled, and a nursing station that always smelled faintly of hand sanitizer and old coffee. She'd been at this hospital for 3 years. In that time, she had learned which supply cabinet stuck, which monitors ran 5% low on oxygen readings, and exactly how long it took the on-call pharmacy to respond at 2 in the morning versus 2 in the afternoon. She had also learned, very quickly, which physicians she could work around and which ones she couldn't. Dr. Elliot Marsh was not one she could work around. I was 53, tall in the way that men who played college athletics still carry decades later, broad through the shoulders, thick through the neck, with a handshake that lasted a beat too long, and a voice that filled whatever room he entered. He had been at Harlow General for 19 years. He was chief of emergency medicine, which meant his name appeared on the budget approvals, the staff evaluations, and the quarterly reports that went to the hospital's board of directors. He was also the kind of physician who believed that the chain of command existed primarily for his benefit, and that anyone below him on that chain existed primarily to confirm his decisions rather than question them. Claire had questioned him twice in 3 years, both times quietly, both times correctly. Both times he had smiled the smile of a man who filed things away for later. She was checking a chart at the nursing station when the radio on the desk crackled. "Medic 1 to General, we are inbound with a 47-year-old male, GSW to the right shoulder. BP is dropping. We've got pressure on the wound, but he's combative. ETA 4 minutes. The charge nurse, a compact woman named Deb Forsyth, who had worked the ED for 11 years, was already moving. "Bay 4, get it prepped. Navarro, you're on this one." "Copy," Claire said, setting the chart down. She was pulling gloves from the dispenser outside Bay 4 when she heard Marsh's voice behind her. "I've got this one." She turned. He was standing in the corridor in his white coat, coffee mug in one hand, reading something on his phone. He hadn't looked up. "Deb assigned me," Claire said. "I'm reassigning you." He still hadn't looked up. "Check on the woman in Bay 7. She's been waiting on blood work results. The Bay 7 patient is stable. The incoming GSW is going to need Claire." He looked up then, and his expression was entirely pleasant. That was the thing about Elliot Marsh that people who hadn't worked with him didn't understand. He was almost never visibly angry. He didn't need to be. "I said I've got it. What I need from you is to go check on the patient in Bay 7. That's your job. This," he gestured vaguely toward the trauma bay, "is mine." She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she pulled off one glove, set it on the supply cart, and walked toward Bay 7. The woman in Bay 7 was 62, there for a possible cardiac event that had already been ruled out as severe acid reflux. She was sitting up in the bed watching something on her phone with one earbud in and looked entirely unbothered. Claire checked her vitals, reviewed the lab results on the wall monitor, all within normal range, and documented the visit. She was back at the nursing station in under 4 minutes. The GSW patient had arrived. Through the partially open curtain of Bay 4, she could see Marsh moving, could hear him issuing instructions to the 2 nurses assisting him. She could also see, without needing to enter the bay, that the patient's pressure cuff reading on the monitor outside was 84/52, and the waveform was wrong, shallow and irregular in a way that suggested the shoulder wound wasn't the primary problem. She'd seen that pattern before. In different circumstances, in a different life. In the back of a transport vehicle that was not a hospital and not clean and not quiet. She knew what that pressure waveform meant. She stepped to the curtain. "Dr. Marsh, his pressure is, I can read a monitor." He didn't look at her. "The waveform is showing. Navarro." He looked at her then, and the pleasantness was gone. Not replaced by anger, just gone, the way a mask gets removed when the audience has left. "I will ask you one more time. Remove yourself from this bay." One of the assisting nurses, a younger woman named Priya, who had only been at Harlow General for 8 months, looked at Claire with something uncomfortable in her eyes. Not a plea. Just discomfort, the kind that comes from witnessing a thing you don't have the standing to stop. Claire looked at the monitor one more time. Then she stepped back from the curtain. She returned to the nursing station. She sat down. She pulled up the patient's intake file on the computer and began reading it, not because she needed to, but because she needed something to do with her hands while she waited to see if she was wrong. She was not wrong. 11 minutes later, Marsh was calling for a crash cart. The patient survived. It took 40 minutes, and a second physician who happened to be passing through, Dr. Sonia Wren, an internist who had no business being in the trauma wing but who had sharp eyes and didn't hesitate, to stabilize him properly. When it was over and the bay was quiet again, Marsh walked past the nursing station without speaking. Deb leaned close to Claire and said very quietly, "You should have pushed harder." "I pushed exactly as hard as I was allowed to," Claire said. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Claire didn't answer that. She went back to work. The call came through at 8:47 p.m. Not a radio call, not an ambulance. A man walked through the ambulance bay doors on foot, soaking wet from the rain, carrying a German shepherd that was limp and heavy across both his arms. The dog was breathing. Claire could see the chest rising from across the room, but the front left leg was at an angle that made her stomach go quiet in that specific way it did when the body understood something before the mind had finished processing it. The man carrying the dog was in civilian clothes, jeans, a gray jacket with water pouring off it. But he moved the way military people move. Deliberate, no wasted motion, head up even under the weight of the animal. He was somewhere in his late 30s, dark hair plastered flat by the rain, and the expression on his face was the particular expression of someone who was holding themselves together by force of will and had been doing so for long enough that it was costing him something. "I need help," he said. Not shouted. Said, directly, without the edge of panic, which somehow made it worse. The triage desk nurse, a young man named Trevor, looked up. "Sir, this is a human medical facility. For Animal. He's a working dog, K9 unit. His name is Bravo, and he took impact from a vehicle about 40 minutes ago, and I couldn't get the emergency vet to answer, and his breathing has been getting shallower for the last 10 minutes. The man looked at Trevor steadily. "I need someone who knows what they're doing." Claire was already moving. She wasn't the first to reach him. Trevor had stood up, Deb had appeared from around the corner, but she was the first to drop to the level of the dog, because she was already moving toward the floor before the man had finished speaking. She put her hands on Bravo without asking permission, without explaining herself, without the hesitation that comes from needing to think about whether you know what you're doing. She didn't need to think about it. "What's his name again?" she asked the man. "Bravo? How old?" "4. How long was he down before you picked him up?" "Maybe 2 minutes. He tried to get up on his own." She was palpating the dog's abdomen carefully, her fingers reading the tension in the muscle. The leg was definitely fractured, probably the radius, possibly compound, hard to tell without imaging. But that wasn't what concerned her. What concerned her was the quality of the breathing. Short, effortful, and the color of the visible mucous membrane around the dog's mouth, which was not the pink it should have been. "Do you have any imaging capability here? Portable ultrasound?" She looked up at Deb. Deb blinked. "Claire, we can't—" "I know we're not a vet clinic. I'm asking if we have portable ultrasound I can use to check for internal bleeding. We have the point-of-care units. Get me one." She looked back at Bravo. His breathing had changed slightly. She could feel it under her hands, a subtle shift, and she pressed 2 fingers gently against the left side of his chest, just behind the elbow. There. The resistance was wrong. Not absent, but wrong. Asymmetric in a way that told her something she didn't want to know yet. "He's got fluid accumulating," she said, mostly to herself. "Is that bad?" the man asked. "It depends on how fast and where from." She looked up at him. "I'm Claire. I'm a trauma nurse. I need you to stay calm and stay with me, okay?" He nodded once. "I'm Sergeant Wick. Daniel Wick." "Sergeant Wick, has Bravo had any vaccinations documented recently? Any existing medical conditions I should know about?" "He's current on everything. His vet records are in my phone. I can pull them up." "Do that." The portable ultrasound unit arrived in Deb's hands 2 minutes later, and Claire was reaching for it when she heard Marcia's voice from the corridor behind her. "What exactly is happening here?" It wasn't a question. It was the tone someone uses when they've already decided the answer and just want the person responsible to confirm it. Claire didn't look up. She was positioning the probe. "K9 officer, suspected internal trauma post-vehicle impact. I'm checking for hemorrhage." "You're performing ultrasound on a dog in my emergency department." "I'm performing fast exam assessment on a working military animal who is in respiratory distress." She moved the probe. The screen showed her what she'd suspected: fluid in the pleural space, left side building pressure against the lung. Not yet critical. Not far from it. Marsh stepped closer. "Navarro, remove that equipment and—" "He's got a hemothorax." She kept her voice flat. Not defiant, just informational. "Left side. If it's building at the rate I think it is, he's got maybe 30 minutes before his lung capacity drops below functional." The room went quiet. Sergeant Wick had gone very still on the floor beside her. Marsh was silent for 3 seconds. Then, "You are not a veterinarian. You have no authority to operate that equipment on an animal. No authority to diagnose—" "I know what I'm looking at." She looked up at him then, for the first time since she'd hit the floor. "I've done field thoracentesis on a dog before. I can do it again. Or you can call Dr. Adler at Harlow Animal Emergency. I have the number. But she's across town and the rain is backing up traffic on Route 9, which means she's probably 40 minutes out minimum." She held his gaze. 30 minutes? 40 minutes out. You do that math." Marsh stared at her. "He's a service animal," Daniel Wick said from the floor, very quietly. "He's been active duty for 3 years. Marsh looked at the dog. He looked at Claire. Something moved across his face. Not compassion, she didn't think. More like calculation. "You have 15 minutes, he said. "And when this is over, you and I are going to have a very different kind of conversation." "Fine," she said, and went back to work. What happened in those next 15 minutes was the kind of thing that doesn't get described properly in reports or paperwork, because the language of reports, procedure, intervention, outcome, strips out everything that makes a moment real. What was real was this. Claire worked with the focus of someone who had learned how to do difficult things in conditions that were worse than this, in places that were worse than this, and she did not hurry in the frantic way that looks like urgency but produces mistakes. She moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had already survived the kind of situation where there was no margin for error. Priya, the young nurse who had watched the Bay 4 confrontation earlier, appeared at Claire's elbow without being asked and began handing her what she needed before she requested it. A small, unconscious synchronization that happens between medical people who are paying attention to the same thing. 18 gauge, Priya asked. 16, and I need the extension tubing. Got it. The needle went in cleanly. The blood-tinged fluid that emerged confirmed the hemothorax exactly where the ultrasound had indicated. Claire kept her hand steady and her eyes on the collection chamber and didn't speak for 90 seconds. Bravo's breathing changed, slowly, not dramatically, not the movie version of an animal suddenly surging back to life, but measurably. The short, effortful quality eased by a fraction. His ribcage moved differently. His mucous membranes, when she checked again, had shifted toward a better color. "There," she said. Sergeant Wick, who had been kneeling on the wet floor tile the entire time, let out a breath that he seemed to have been holding since he walked through the doors. "He's not out of it yet," Claire said. "The leg needs imaging and probably surgery. The hemothorax will need monitoring. He needs a vet facility with overnight capability and imaging equipment." She looked at Wick. "I can stabilize him. I can't fix him. You understand the difference?" "Yes," Wick said. "Yes, I understand. Thank you." He paused. "How did you know how to do that?" She was already pulling off her gloves. "Field medicine has a lot of overlap with emergency veterinary care. Anatomy is different, but pressure is pressure, and fluid is fluid." She stood. "Call Dr. Adler now. Tell her what I found and what I did, and she'll know what to receive." She handed Priya the used equipment without looking at Marsh, who was still standing at the edge of the scene, and walked toward the supply disposal unit. She heard him follow her. "My office," he said. "Now." She dropped the gloves in the bin, turned, and walked with him. Walked out. His office was a corner room with 2 windows that overlooked the parking structure, a desk with more surface area than function, and a wall of framed certificates arranged in the careful way of a man who needed people to see them. He sat behind the desk. He did not offer her a seat. "You are not authorized to perform medical procedures on animals in this facility," he said. "You are not a veterinarian. You are not a physician. You overstepped your role, you commandeered hospital equipment, and you did it in front of a patient's family member and multiple staff members after I had explicitly told you to stand down." He folded his hands on the desk. "I'm putting you on administrative leave pending a formal review." Claire stood in the center of the room. She had known this conversation was coming since about 40 seconds after she'd started the FAST exam, knowing it didn't make it less unpleasant. "The dog would have died," she said. "That may or may not be true. It's not relevant. It's—" She stopped. She looked at the wall of certificates for one moment. Then she looked back at him. "It's the only thing that's relevant. This is a medical facility, Claire. It operates on protocol and hierarchy, and you pulled me off the GSW in Bay 4 tonight because you didn't want me there, and 40 minutes later you were calling for a crash cart." She said it evenly. Not accusation, just data. "I'm not the problem in this building, Dr. Marsh." The room got very quiet. He looked at her the way men look at people who have said the true thing in a room where the true thing is inconvenient. His jaw moved once. "You're dismissed. Collect your personal belongings from your locker. The review committee will contact you within 5 business days." She looked at him for 3 seconds longer than was comfortable, not because she was trying to intimidate him, because she was deciding whether there was anything left to say. There wasn't. She turned and walked out. She was at her locker when Deb found her. The charge nurse stepped into the narrow staff corridor and closed the door behind her, which was not something Deb did unless the conversation warranted privacy. "He's putting it in writing tonight," Deb said. "I heard him on the phone with HR." "I know." Claire pulled her jacket from the hook, checked the pockets out of habit. "Priya is documenting what she saw, both incidents. That's her choice." "Claire." Deb moved closer, lowering her voice even though there was no one else in the corridor. "I have seen him do this before. 2 nurses in the last 4 years. 1 quit, 1 transferred. He finds the ones who are good enough to make him look bad, and I know how it works, Deb. Do you know that his review process has never once ruled against him? Not once. In 19 years. Claire zipped her jacket. "I know." "Then why do you look like you're not scared?" Claire thought about that. The honest answer was complicated. The short answer was that she had been scared in conditions that made this office politics look like a scheduling disagreement, and she had worked in those conditions anyway, and something about that experience made it difficult to locate the correct amount of alarm for a situation where the stakes were paperwork. But she didn't say any of that. Instead, she said, "Because he's going to make a mistake." "What makes you think that?" "Because he already did." She picked up her bag. "And someone has it on camera." She meant the FAST exam. She meant Bay 4. She wasn't sure exactly what the cameras had captured, but she'd worked in that department for 3 years, and she knew where every lens pointed. She left the hospital through the staff exit, walking out into the rain, which had not let up. In the ambulance bay, she passed Sergeant Wick, who was sitting on the bench under the overhang, waiting for the animal transport vehicle he'd arranged. Bravo was on the gurney beside him, stabilized, breathing better, his fractured leg wrapped and immobilized. The dog's eyes were open. When Claire passed, Bravo's head turned and his eyes tracked her with the slow, deliberate focus of an animal that was not entirely present but was registering something important. Wick looked up. "They told me you got suspended. Administrative leave," she said, "pending review." "Because of Bravo." "Among other things." He was quiet for a moment. The rain made white noise against the overhang. "You ever work with dogs before? Military dogs?" She looked at Bravo. "Once or twice," she said. "A long time ago." Something moved across his face. Not recognition, exactly. More like the beginning of a question he hadn't fully formed yet. He looked at her hands, at the way she was standing, and then back at her face. "Where did you say you learned field medicine?" he asked. "I didn't," she said. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine, listening to the rain on the roof. Her right hand, the one she'd used to hold the needle steady, had a faint tremor in it. Not from fear. From the thing that happens after the focus releases. When the body finally remembers that it was holding itself very tightly. She pressed her palm flat against her knee until the tremor stopped. Then she looked in the rear-view mirror at the hospital entrance, where the fluorescent lights spilled out across the wet pavement, and she thought about Elliot Marsh in his office with his framed certificates and his 19 years and his unbroken review record. And she thought about the GSW patient whose pressure waveform she'd read correctly and been removed from, and she thought about Bravo's eyes tracking her as she walked away. She started the car. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her before she could put it in reverse. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then something made her pick up. "Is this Claire Navarro?" The voice on the other end was a woman's voice, professional, with the cadence of someone who is accustomed to being answered promptly. "Yes. My name is Agent Renata Solis. I'm with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office." A brief pause. "Miss Navarro, we've been made aware of an incident at Harlow General Medical Center tonight involving a K-9 officer and a nurse with a background that our office finds significant." Another pause, this one with weight behind it. "I'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning, if you're available." Claire looked at the hospital entrance in her rear-view mirror. The fluorescent lights kept spilling. "How did you get this number?" she asked. "Sergeant Wick called us," Agent Solis said. "He told us what he saw, and he told us what he recognized." The rain hammered down on the car roof, and the silence between them lasted just long enough for Claire's hand to press flat against her knee again. "What time?" she said. 7, Agent Solis said. "There's a diner on Callaway Street called Merritt's, corner booth. I'll find you." The call ended before Claire could ask another question. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, watching the rain streak down the windshield in crooked lines, and then she set it on the passenger seat and pulled out of the parking lot with the specific, deliberate calm of someone who had learned that visible agitation was a liability. The drive home took 14 minutes. She didn't turn on the radio. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted building on Aldine Avenue, the kind of place that had good bones and mediocre maintenance. Radiator that knocked in winter. Bathroom tile that had been regrouted twice and still leaked at the corner. A narrow kitchen that faced west and got good afternoon light on the days she was home to see it. She'd lived there for 2.5 years. The walls were mostly bare. There were books on the shelf by the window and a few framed photographs on the bedroom dresser that she kept turned slightly toward the wall. Not hidden, but not displayed either. The way you position something you're not ready to explain. She showered. She made tea. She didn't drink. She lay down on the bed in the dark with her right arm across her eyes and did not sleep for a long time. What Sergeant Wick had recognized. She didn't know exactly. She didn't know him. She had run through his face during the drive home, cross-referencing against the catalog her memory kept of names, units, places, years, and he didn't appear anywhere she could locate. That didn't mean nothing. Her extraction had involved personnel from 3 different units, some of whom she'd never been formally introduced to, and the chaos of that night had blurred certain details in ways that 11 years of subsequent living had not entirely restored. What she knew was this: she had been 29 years old. She had been a combat medic attached to a forward operating base in a place the Army preferred not to name in official documents. There had been an ambush during a convoy extraction, a vehicle fire, a collapsed structure, and a window of approximately 4 minutes during which the difference between how many people walked away and how many didn't was almost entirely a function of what she did with her hands in those 4 minutes. She had carried a soldier out over her left shoulder while pressing a field dressing against a wound on his neck with her right hand. She had done it through smoke thick enough to make the air solid. She had done it with burns she didn't fully register until she was on the transport back and someone pointed at her and said something she couldn't hear over the ringing. The burns had healed into scars that ran from her right shoulder across the top of her back and down the outer aspect of her right arm to the elbow. She kept them covered, not because she was ashamed. The emotion she associated with them was more complicated than shame, but because the questions they generated were conversations she didn't have the energy for. She had been honorably discharged 14 months after the extraction. The paperwork cited medical reasons, which was accurate. The paperwork did not cite the other reasons, which were also accurate but less convenient to document. She'd become a nurse because she already knew how to do most of it, and because the alternative was a version of civilian life that felt entirely unmoored. The structure helped. The work helped. The fact that in emergency medicine, the gap between what you knew and what you were allowed to do was sometimes very narrow. That part she had not fully anticipated, and it had been a source of friction in every job she'd held since. Elliot Marsh was not the first. He was just the most recent. She was asleep by midnight and awake again by 5, which was typical. She dressed in the dark, drank the tea she should have made the night before, and was in her car by 6:30. Merritt's Diner on Callaway Street was the kind of place that had survived 3 recessions and the arrival of a chain coffee shop across the street by being exactly what it was and not apologizing for it. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, coffee that arrived before you asked for it and got refilled without ceremony. Claire arrived 8 minutes before 7 and took the corner booth, positioning herself with her back to the wall and a clear sight line to the door, which was not a conscious decision. It was just where she sat. Agent Renata Solis arrived at exactly 7. She was in her mid-40s, brown-skinned, with the kind of posture that came from years of having to establish authority in rooms that didn't automatically offer it. She wore a gray blazer over a dark shirt, no visible badge because this was not that kind of meeting, and she moved through the diner with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done many of these and understood that the first 2 minutes set the tone for everything that followed. She slid into the booth across from Claire, accepted the coffee the server offered, and looked at Claire directly. "You look like you didn't sleep much," she said. "Some," Claire said. "I'll be straight with you because that tends to work better." Solis wrapped both hands around her mug. "Sergeant Wick's call to our office last night wasn't the first time your name has come up in a DoD context in the past 18 months. Claire said nothing. "There's an ongoing review process. I'm not going to give you details you don't need yet. Related to medical practices at several civilian facilities that serve veteran populations in this region. Harlow General is one of them." Solis watched her carefully. "Your name appeared in a complaint filed by a veteran patient 8 months ago. It wasn't a complaint against you. It was a complaint that cited you by name as the only person in the facility who had correctly identified a service-related condition that 2 physicians had missed." She paused. "The complaint was filed against those physicians, and against the administrative processes that allowed the misdiagnosis to persist." Claire turned her coffee mug a quarter turn on the table. "And the complaint went nowhere." "The complaint went into a file," Solis said, "which is slightly different from nowhere, but I take your point." She set her mug down. "What happened at the hospital last night, with Sergeant Wick and the K-9? That's been documented by the sergeant and submitted to our office already. He has a particular attention to detail." Something moved across her face that might have been a small, dry appreciation. "He also told us something else." "What?" Solis looked at her steadily. "He said he recognized the way you moved. He served 2 tours. He's been around enough combat medics to know the difference between someone who learned field medicine in a classroom and someone who learned it in a field." She let that sit for a moment. "He said you didn't hesitate. Not once. And that you positioned yourself in relation to the dog and the corridor and the other people in the room in a way that was tactical, not medical. He said it happened too fast for you to have been doing it consciously." Another pause. "He wanted to know your unit." The diner was filling up around them. A man at the counter was arguing cheerfully with the server about whether the weekend's game had been called correctly. Someone's child was complaining about eggs. The world was doing what it always did, which was continuing at normal volume entirely, regardless of what was happening in any given corner booth. "What do you need from me?" Claire asked. "Right now? A conversation." Solis reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table, not opening it. "I want to understand what's been happening at Harlow General for the past 3 years. I want to understand it from your perspective, in your words, and I want to know what you know about Elliot Marsh. I'm on administrative leave. If I talk to you, that review process. The review process is going to go exactly where Marsh wants it to go unless something changes the terrain." Solis was still watching her. "I'm not asking you to file a complaint. I'm not asking you to do anything that puts you in a more exposed position than you're already in. I'm asking you to talk to me." She let the quiet stretch out a few seconds. "He's done this before, Ms. Navarro. We both know that." Claire looked at the folder. She looked at the window. The street outside was still wet from the previous night's rain, catching early morning light in the way wet pavement does. Not beautiful exactly, but honest. 3 years, she said. "Where do you want me to start?" She talked for 90 minutes. She didn't embellish, and she didn't minimize, and she described what she had observed and documented, and what she had witnessed that could not be documented. The tone shifts, the strategic absences, the way Marsh managed information between departments so that no single person had the full picture. Solis asked clean questions and took notes on a legal pad in shorthand that Claire couldn't read from across the table and didn't try to. When Claire finished, Solis looked at her notes for a moment without speaking. "Bay 4, she said finally. "The GSW. You said you believed the patient's deterioration was preventable." "I said the deterioration was predictable from the data that was visible on the monitor. Whether it was preventable depends on choices that weren't mine to make." "But you were removed from that case." "I was removed from that case." "Deliberately." "You'd have to ask Dr. Marsh about his intentions." Solis looked at her. "What do you think?" Claire turned her coffee mug another quarter turn. "I think he pulled me off that case because he didn't want me in that bay. And I think the reason he didn't want me in that bay is the same reason he's been pulling me off high-acuity cases for 8 months. I make him look like what he is." The words sat there. Solis nodded once, slowly. "The security footage from last night. Do you know what it captured?" "I know where the cameras are." "We're requesting access to it today. Hospital administration is going to push back. They generally do. But there's a federal interest angle that will move it faster than a standard request." She closed her notepad. "In the meantime, I'd strongly suggest you not have any further direct communication with Dr. Marsh or hospital administration." "I'm on administrative leave. I don't have a reason to." "People find reasons." Solis gathered her things, paused. "One more thing. Sergeant Wick asked me to give you a message." Claire waited. "He said, 'Atlas is coming.'" The name landed somewhere below Claire's sternum in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee or the diner or the wet morning street outside. Her expression didn't change. She was very practiced at that. "I don't know what that means," she said. Solis looked at her for a long moment. "I think you might," she said, and left 2 bills on the table for the coffee, stood up, and walked out of the diner. Claire stayed in the booth for 11 minutes after Solis left. She drank the rest of her coffee, which had gone cold, and she looked at the door, and she thought about a name she had not heard spoken aloud in 11 years. Atlas. There had been a dog. There was always a dog, in the version of that story that played out in her memory at odd hours. Not a dramatic cinematic dog, but a real one, working, scarred along his left flank from shrapnel, with the particular dark-masked face of a German shepherd, and eyes that had the quality of paying attention to everything simultaneously. His handler had been a staff sergeant named Kellerman, and Kellerman had not come out of the burning convoy. Atlas had. She had carried Atlas for the last 40 meters because he'd taken a fragment through the left hind leg and couldn't run. She'd carried him and Kellerman's rifle and part of a soldier named Dario, who was conscious and insisted on holding his own IV bag, and she had made it to the extraction point 11 seconds before the secondary collapse. Atlas had survived. She had not been informed of what happened to him after. Working dogs got reassigned. They had careers that continued beyond their handlers, lives that weren't documented in the same way human service members were. She had told herself over the years that this was fine, that not knowing was fine, that the chapter had closed and the next one was what mattered. Atlas is coming. She left the diner and drove 3 blocks before pulling into a parking lot and sitting for a moment with the engine idling. She thought about Sergeant Wick's face in the ambulance bay the night before, the way his eyes had moved over her. Not romantically, nothing like that, but with the particular attentiveness of someone processing information against a template they already held. She thought about what Solis had said. He recognized the way you moved. She pulled her phone out and searched for Sergeant Daniel Wick, K9 unit, and found nothing useful, which was expected. Military personnel weren't indexed the way civilians were. She found a brief mention in a local news article about a department event from 2 years ago, a photograph of a unit and their dogs, and she enlarged the image and studied the faces and still couldn't place him. Her phone rang. Unknown number, different from the one Solis had used. Claire Navarro, she answered. It's Wick. His voice was different in the daylight, less compressed, not softer, just less edited. I told Agent Solis to give you a name, did she? She did. Do you know that name? A brief silence, during which the traffic light at the end of the parking lot cycled through its colors twice. I know it, she said. Then you know why I'm calling. Tell me anyway. She heard him exhale. I served with a man named Kellerman, Staff Sergeant Pete Kellerman, 3rd Brigade. He talked about his medic the same way some guys talk about the person who pulled them out of a car wreck. Not often, and never the whole story, just pieces of it when his guard was down. He said the medic carried Atlas out of a fire zone when the dog couldn't run, and that she had burns on her arm afterward that she didn't mention until someone pointed at them. A pause. He showed me a photograph once. Dark hair. About this tall. Another pause. He said if he ever found her, he owed her a conversation. Kellerman didn't make it out, Claire said. I know. Wick's voice changed slightly on those 2 words. A texture to it, brief and real. He died 2 years after he got back. Medical reasons, service connected. He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask. But some of us did make it out. Some of us have been looking for his medic for a long time. And Bravo. The way Bravo looked at you last night when you walked past. He stopped. Working dogs remember people. Not the way we remember, but they remember. Bravo was at that FOB. He wasn't Atlas, but he knew Atlas. They ran together for almost a year. Claire's hand was very still on the steering wheel. What do you want from me, Sergeant Wick? Right now, nothing. I just wanted you to know that some of us know who you are. A pause. And I wanted you to know that Atlas, the actual Atlas, he's been retired for 3 years. He's with a handler in Morgantown. And the people who know his story, they've been trying to find the person Kellerman talked about for a while now. Because there's something that should have been done a long time ago that wasn't. What kind of something? The kind that requires finding the right person first. His voice was steady and direct, the voice of someone stating facts rather than making a case. There are people who want to come to Harlow General, Ms. Navarro. People who want to stand next to you in that building. I wanted to ask if that's something you'd want. She looked through the windshield at the parking lot, the wet asphalt, the ordinary geometry of a weekday morning. You should know, she said, that I'm on administrative leave as of last night. The hospital is not a friendly environment right now. I know, Wick said. That's exactly why we want to come. The formal notification of administrative leave arrived in her email at 9:14 a.m., a document from Harlow General's HR department that used words like pending review and standard protocol, and expressed concern for appropriate professional boundaries in language so carefully sanitized that it almost sounded reasonable. She read it twice, then she forwarded it to Agent Solis with a single line. For your records. She spent the rest of the morning doing ordinary things. Grocery store. Laundry. A call to her sister in Roanoke that she kept short because she didn't want to explain what was happening, and her sister had enough of her own things. She ate lunch standing at the kitchen counter looking out the window at the street below, and she thought about the word review and the word pending and the 19-year track record that Deb had described and the wall of framed certificates in Marcia's office. At 2:30 p.m., her phone rang. It was Priya. I filed the documentation, Priya said without preamble. Both incidents, Bay 4 and the K9 situation. I documented everything I observed with timestamps. You didn't have to do that. I know. A brief pause. I've been here 8 months, and I've been watching him operate for 8 months, and I just... She stopped. Started again. He moved you off that case on purpose. I was in that bay. I saw his face when he told you to leave, and it wasn't about the case. It was about you specifically, and I... Another stop. I'm not good at this kind of thing. Confrontation. I'm not brave the way you are. You just filed documentation against a chief of emergency medicine 8 months into your first job, Claire said. That's not nothing. I'm terrified, Priya said, and the honesty of it landed like something real. That's what brave actually is, Claire said. Not the absence of it, just doing it anyway. A pause. Will you get your job back? I don't know. What are you going to do? Claire looked at the window. Wait, she said, and let him make the next move. She paused. Thank you, Priya. I mean it. After she hung up, she sat with the phone for a moment, and then she opened her contacts and found Wick's number. He'd sent it as a follow-up text that morning and typed, "When are they coming?" His reply arrived 4 minutes later. Tomorrow. Is that too soon? She typed, no. Then she set the phone on the counter and finished her lunch. They arrived at 11 a.m. the next morning. She was not at the hospital. She was in the coffee shop on the ground floor of the building across the street, a small, independent place with 2 tables and a window seat. When her phone buzzed with a text from Wick, "We're outside. You should probably see this." She looked through the window. There were 9 of them, not counting Wick. They were in civilian clothes. No uniforms, no insignia, nothing that announced their military backgrounds to anyone who didn't already know what to look for. But they moved in a group with the particular spatial awareness of people accustomed to operating in coordinated formation, and every one of them was standing straight, and several of them were carrying folders or envelopes or bags. And at the center of the group, sitting calmly on the sidewalk outside the main entrance of Harlow General Medical Center, with the patience of an animal that had outlived urgency, was a German shepherd. He was older. Gray along the muzzle, the movement of his hips slightly deliberate in the way of a dog who has put serious mileage on a body that was built to run. His left hind leg, she could see from across the street, did not bear weight quite the way the right one did. Atlas. She sat very still in the window seat. The dog was looking at the hospital entrance the way working dogs look at things. Not casual, not distracted, but with complete attentiveness, like he was waiting for something specific. The handler beside him, a younger man, 20s, she didn't know him, had the leash, but the leash was slack. Atlas wasn't going anywhere. Wick texted again. "Come out when you're ready. No pressure." She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it down again. Then she put on her jacket, picked up her bag, and walked out of the coffee shop and across the street. She was halfway across when Atlas moved. He didn't lunge. He didn't bark. He stood up from his sitting position with the deliberate motion of an old dog conserving energy, and then he oriented his whole body in her direction. And then, before his handler had processed what was happening, before the leash went taut or anyone had time to speak, Atlas walked forward, directly toward her, with the slow, certain purpose of an animal who was not confused about what it recognized. He reached her on the sidewalk and pressed the full weight of his head against the outside of her right thigh, just below the hip, and stood there. She put her hand on his head, her right hand, the scarred one. He didn't flinch. She had been a long time since she'd felt something move through her the way that moment did. Not pain, not grief exactly, but something that had been held in a compressed state for 11 years and was taking up more space now. She kept her hand on his head and breathed through it. "He's been doing this for 2 years, the handler said quietly. "Whenever he's around female veterans." Our handler said, he stopped. He said there was someone specific, someone he was looking for. She didn't answer that. She looked at Wick, who was standing 4 feet away, watching her with the steady, undemanding quality of someone who understands that some moments require silence. "You have documentation," she said. "Yes." "For the hospital administration?" "For the hospital, and for Agent Solis, and for the review committee that Marsh is convening." He looked at her without rushing anything. "We also have people who have been trying to reach Harlow General's board directly for 6 weeks and being redirected. Whatever he's built in that place, the insulation, the process controls, we've been watching it and we know how it works." "What's in the folders?" "Medical records, testimony. Documentation from veterans who were patients here and whose care was mismanaged. 3 families who don't know each other, but whose complaints were all filed against the same physician and all quietly routed into the same administrative dead end. His jaw tightened briefly. And our own records. About that extraction. About what was done and by whom, and the fact that a combat medic carried 3 people and a working dog out of a fire zone and was never formally recognized for it because the paperwork got tangled in a classified designation. Claire looked at the folder in his hand and then at Atlas, whose head was still against her leg. Marsh has been controlling intake reviews for veteran patients for 4 years, Wick continued. We couldn't prove it without an inside perspective, without someone who had watched it operate up close. He looked at her directly. You were watching it operate up close. She thought about the GSW in Bay 4. She thought about the veteran patient 8 months ago, the one who'd filed the complaint that mentioned her by name. She thought about Deb saying he'd done this before, and the 2 nurses in 4 years, and the unbroken review record. She thought about Priya, 8 months in, and terrified and documenting it anyway. The board won't move on this quickly, she said. Marcia spent 19 years building relationships in that building. The board won't move, Wick agreed, but the Inspector General's office will. And once the IG starts pulling records, the board will move because they won't have a choice. He held her gaze. But it needs a trigger. A specific documented recent incident that creates federal jurisdiction. He paused. The K9 situation last night technically meets the threshold. A federally registered working dog treated in a civilian facility by a nurse who was subsequently suspended. That's federal interest. He suspended me for performing an emergency procedure that saved the dog's life. Which is exactly why it works. Wick's voice was steady. Marsh put it in writing. He filed it with HR last night. He documented that he suspended you for that specific action. A beat. He gave us the trigger. The morning traffic moved on the street behind her. Atlas shifted his weight slightly and pressed more firmly against her leg, as if noting that she'd tensed up and was making a professional assessment. She looked at the hospital entrance. 19 years. Framed certificates. An unbroken review record, and 2 nurses who'd disappeared quietly, and a GSW patient who had needed a crash cart 40 minutes after she'd been pulled off the case. When does Solace move? She asked. This afternoon, Wick said. She's requesting the security footage and the HR documentation simultaneously. By tonight, the hospital will know this is federal. She nodded once, slowly. And Marsh? She asked. Wick looked at the entrance. He doesn't know we're here yet. He paused. But he's going to look out that window and see 9 veterans, a retired military working dog, and an Army combat medic standing on his sidewalk. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the specific look of someone who understands the weight of a moment. And then he's going to know. She looked at the building. She looked at the door. She thought about the version of herself who had walked out of it the night before in the rain, alone, with a tremor in her right hand. He called me just a nurse, she said. I know, Wick said. In front of his staff, in front of a patient's family member, he said it like it was a verdict. I know. His voice was quiet. She looked at Atlas one more time, at the gray along his muzzle and the way he'd come to her without hesitation, the way he stood beside her now like standing beside her was simply where he was supposed to be. Then she straightened. She looked at the hospital entrance with the fluorescent lights visible through the glass, even in the daylight, and the HR department on the 4th floor where a document with her name on it was sitting in a file, and the corner office where a man with 19 years and a wall of certificates was somewhere behind those windows. Then let's go inside, she said. And the automatic doors of Harlow General Medical Center slid open like they always did, indifferent and mechanical, while 9 veterans and a retired military working dog and a woman with scars she had stopped explaining fell into step behind her and walked through them. The lobby of Harlow General at 11 in the morning had the particular energy of a place that had settled into its daily rhythm. Intake desk staffed, waiting area half full, the overhead PA cycling through routine announcements with the flat cadence of a system that never varied. The security guard at the front desk, a heavy-set man named Ortiz, who had worked the morning shift for 6 years and had seen most things, looked up when the automatic doors opened and then kept looking, because what came through them was not the usual configuration. 9 people, moving together but not in formation. A woman at the front who he recognized, the nurse, Navarro, The one who'd been in some kind of incident the night before. He'd heard the talk. And a dog. A large German shepherd, old, moving deliberately, the leash held by a young man who looked like he hadn't needed the leash in a while. Ortiz put his hand on the desk phone, and then didn't pick it up, because none of them were moving fast or loud, and there was something about the quality of their entry that made him uncertain what category of event this was. Claire walked to the intake desk and looked at him directly. "I need to speak with the administrator on duty, not Dr. Marsh, the hospital administrator." "Miss Navarro, you're on administrative leave. I'm not here as an employee. I'm here as a witness." She put a card on the desk, Agent Solis's card, the number handwritten on the back. "The Department of Defense Inspector General's office will be calling this facility within the hour. I'd suggest the administrator on duty takes my meeting before that call arrives rather than after." Ortiz looked at the card, looked at the group behind her, looked at Atlas, who was sitting calmly beside her right knee, watching the desk with the complete attentiveness that working dogs brought to everything. He picked up the phone. "Oh." The administrator on duty was a woman named Patricia Holt, 58, who had spent 22 years in hospital administration and had developed the particular skill of projecting absolute calm while processing information at speed. She came down from the 4th floor in 4 minutes, which told Claire she'd been briefed by Ortiz on the way and had made the calculation that showing up fast was better than showing up prepared. She looked at the group in the lobby. She looked at Claire. She looked at Atlas. "Ms. Navarro," she said carefully, "I understand you're here with—" "Sergeant Daniel Wick," Wick said, stepping forward and extending a hand with the directness of someone who understood that a firm introduction early sets the frame for everything after. "And several colleagues who served with veteran patients who received care at this facility." He held out a folder, one of the thick ones, the one Claire had seen him carrying on the sidewalk. "We have documented complaints, medical records, and witness testimony related to care decisions made under Dr. Elliot Marsh's administrative authority. We'd like to present them in a formal setting with legal counsel present." Holt looked at the folder, did not take it. "This is highly irregular," she said. "The Inspector General's office tends to make things irregular," Wick said pleasantly. "We thought it was better to have this conversation here first." Something moved through Holt's expression. Not panic, she was too seasoned for that, but the specific recalibration of someone realizing the topology of a situation had shifted without warning. She looked at Claire again. "Are you part of this presentation?" "I'm a witness," Claire said, "to events that occurred in this facility over the past 3 years, including last night." Holt's jaw tightened fractionally. "Dr. Marsh filed an HR report this morning regarding last night's incident. The review process is going to intersect with a federal records request before end of business today," Claire said. "That's not a threat. It's scheduling information." The lobby had gone quiet in the way of public spaces when something is happening that everyone can feel but no one wants to acknowledge directly. The intake desk clerk was finding something very absorbing in her computer screen. 2 people in the waiting area had stopped looking at their phones. Holt looked at the folder in Wick's hand for a long moment. Then she said, "Follow me," and walked toward the elevator. The conference room on the 4th floor had the sterile functionality of a space designed for meetings. Nobody wanted to be in. Rectangular table, adjustable chairs, a whiteboard with old marker residue that hadn't fully erased, a window overlooking the parking structure. Holt sat at one end with a legal pad she hadn't written on yet. Claire sat at the other end. Wick sat to Claire's left. The other veterans distributed themselves along both sides of the table with the easy, unhurried quality of people who had attended enough briefings to know how to occupy a room without filling it unnecessarily. Atlas settled beside Wick's chair. He did not sit. He stood and watched the door. He was still watching it when the door opened and Elliot Marsh walked in. He had not been invited. That was immediately apparent from the way Holt's expression shifted when she saw him. Not surprise, but something closer to resignation, which meant she'd called him, and he'd decided to attend without being asked whether he should. He was in his white coat, which was a choice, and he carried himself with the authority of a man who had entered every room in this building for 19 years and never once been made to feel like a guest. He looked at the table. He looked at Claire. His expression was pleasant in the way that a closed door is pleasant. Smooth surface, nothing visible. "Patricia," he said, "I heard we had visitors." Dr. Marsh, Holt said carefully, I was going to brief you after. No need. He pulled out the chair at the middle of the table's long side and sat down. He looked at Wick. Sergeant. Doctor, Wick said. Marsh looked at Claire with the same pleasantness. You're on administrative leave, Claire. Technically, you're not authorized to be in this building. Technically, she's here as a witness to a federal matter, Wick said, which supersedes your administrative leave. That's an interesting interpretation. Marsh turned to him without heat. Does the Inspector General's office agree? You could ask them. Wick placed his phone on the table. They're available. A silence. Not uncomfortable for the veterans. More uncomfortable for the people who hadn't expected the room to fill in quite this way. Marsh looked at the folders on the table. His eyes moved across them with the practiced speed of a man who assessed risk quickly and well. It was one of the things that made him effective and one of the things that made him dangerous. He looked at Atlas. Something happened in his face then. It was small, and it was fast, and it was gone before most people in the room would have caught it. But Claire had spent years watching him, and she caught it. The slight adjustment around the eyes, the way his jaw shifted a millimeter. Not fear. More like the recalibration of a man who has just updated his threat assessment. What exactly is being presented here? He asked. Holt looked at Wick. Wick opened the first folder. The presentation took 47 minutes. Wick was methodical, without being slow, and the people around the table contributed in turns without being prompted. One woman, a veteran named Sergeant, First Class Deanna Marsh, no relation, she'd noted it dryly at the start, who had been a patient at Harlow General 14 months ago and whose service-connected condition had been dismissed as anxiety by 2 physicians under Marsh's administrative supervision and who had subsequently been correctly diagnosed at a VA facility with traumatic brain sequelae that should have been caught during her initial intake. She spoke without notes and very quietly, and the specific quality of quiet that comes from having to describe a humiliation to a room that still contains the person who orchestrated it. Marsh said nothing. He listened. He took no notes. He maintained the pleasant expression throughout. Wick presented 3 additional cases, all veterans, all patients at Harlow General, all with documented complaints that had been filed through the hospital's internal process and subsequently routed into administrative review channels that, the documentation showed, were managed by a committee whose composition had not changed in 11 years and whose chair reported directly to Marsh. The 4th case was the GSW from Bay 4 2 nights ago. Wick placed the hospital's own monitor log on the table, the timestamp record of the patient's vital signs, printed from the system, showing the pressure readings that Claire had noted and the deterioration that had followed. Beside it, he placed Claire's nursing notes from her brief time on that case and Priya's documentation from the same evening, which Priya had filed through the official system and which, critically, had a timestamp that predated Marsh's HR filing against Claire by 90 minutes. Marsh looked at the documents. His expression didn't change. This is a selective presentation of Dr. Marsh. Agent Solis's voice came from the doorway. She had arrived quietly. Claire hadn't heard her come in, and she was standing at the edge of the room with a second person beside her, a man in a suit who carried a government ID in a way that was visible without being theatrical. She looked at Marsh. I'd ask you to hold your comments for now. What's being presented is entering into a federal record. Marsh turned to look at her. And you are? Agent Renata Solis, DOD Inspector General. She moved to the table, set a document in front of Holt. This is a formal request for access to this facility's security footage, HR records, and patient intake documentation for the period covering the past 4 years. It's a federal records request, which means compliance is required within 24 hours. She looked at Marsh. There's a second document. She placed it in front of him. This is notification that you are named in an ongoing federal review of administrative practices affecting veteran patient care at this facility. You are not under arrest. You are not required to speak. But anything you say in this room from this point forward may be included in that record. The room had gone the specific kind of quiet that happens when the stakes of a situation become undeniable. Marsh looked at the document. His pleasant expression had not changed, but he had not spoken, and the silence had a different quality now. Not the silence of a man who was choosing not to engage, but the silence of a man who was calculating. He looked at Claire. She met his gaze and said nothing. Whatever Marsh had calculated, it took him 3 hours to act on it, and what he did was not what Claire would have predicted, which meant she had underestimated him again, and she filed that away as a reminder that underestimating people who had spent 19 years building institutional power was a mistake she couldn't afford to repeat. At 2:15 p.m., Harlow General's legal counsel, a firm that had represented the hospital for over a decade, filed a countermotion with the Inspector General's office challenging the scope of the federal records request on grounds of patient privacy. It was a legitimate legal argument, technically, in the narrow sense that all legal arguments are technically legitimate until they are not, and it had the effect of pausing the records access by a minimum of 48 hours while the IG's office responded. Wick told her this over the phone. She was in the coffee shop across the street again, because there was where else appropriate to be. Atlas was with her. The handler had gone back to the hotel, and Atlas had simply not moved from beside her chair when the handler stood up, and eventually they'd all looked at each other and the handler had handed her the leash. She hadn't used it since. It lay in a loop beside her foot. "He has a good lawyer," she said. "He has a fast lawyer," Wick corrected. "Good is debatable." She heard paper moving on his end. "Solis says 48 hours doesn't kill this. It slows it. There's enough in what we presented today to continue the review with what the IG already has access to. Priya's documentation, the monitor logs, the veteran case files. The security footage would strengthen it significantly, but it's not the foundation." "What's the foundation?" "Testimony." A pause. "Yours specifically. You were in that building for 3 years. You have direct observational knowledge of how he manages intake, how he routes complaints, how he removes people who challenge him." Another pause. "Solis wants a formal deposition, soon, before Marsh's lawyers have time to build a narrative around the delay." Claire looked at Atlas, who had positioned himself between her chair and the window and was watching the entrance to Harlow General across the street with the patient, permanent attention of a dog who had decided this was his job now. "If I give a deposition," she said, "he'll use it in the review process. He'll argue I have a personal grievance and that everything I documented is colored by that." "He'll argue that regardless," Wick said. "The deposition goes into the federal record. His arguments about your credibility go into the federal record. And then the federal record sits next to the monitor logs and the patient documentation, and everyone can make their own assessment." His voice was steady. "Your testimony is accurate. That's the thing that matters." She thought about Deanna Marsh sitting in that conference room, speaking quietly about a diagnosis that had been missed while the man with framed certificates listened with a pleasant face. She thought about the 2 nurses Deb had mentioned. She thought about the way Priya had said, "I'm terrified," and then filed the documentation anyway. "Set it up," she said. The deposition was scheduled for the following morning, which meant the evening was hers to move through carefully. She went back to her apartment. She ate. She sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote out everything she could recall with date specificity. Every case she'd been pulled from, every complaint she'd been discouraged from filing, every patient whose chart had reflected a decision she couldn't reconcile with their presenting symptoms. It took 2 hours. The list was longer than she'd expected, which was the thing about documentation. It accumulated quietly, item by item, until you laid it all out in sequence and the pattern became undeniable. She was still at the table at 9 p.m. when her phone rang. "Deb." "You should know," Deb said without greeting, "that he pulled the Bay 4 footage." Claire went still. "What?" "The security footage from the night of the GSW, Bay 4 camera, between 8 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. Marsh submitted a request to the hospital's IT security manager this afternoon, citing patient privacy protocols, and the footage was flagged for internal review and temporarily restricted from external access." Deb's voice was tight. "The administrator signed off. She didn't know about the federal records request. Or she knew and chose not to flag the conflict. I don't know which." "Can he do that?" "He did it. Whether he can do it legally is a different question, and by the time that question gets answered, the 48-hour window on the federal request will be up, and his lawyers will file something else." She paused. "Claire, he knows what's on that footage." "What's on it?" A brief silence. "I pulled the log before the restriction went through. I can't access the footage itself. That requires a security clearance I don't have. But the system log shows that the Bay 4 camera was active and recording continuously from 6 p.m. onward that night." A pause. The system log also shows that at 8:43 p.m., someone accessed the Bay 4 chart for the GSW. That's during the window when the patient was deteriorating. Deb's voice dropped lower. Before the crash cart was called. Who accessed it? The log shows the access through a supervisory override code. A beat. His code. The kitchen was very quiet. Claire could hear the radiator in the far corner making its usual noise, the faint sound of traffic from the street 2 floors below. He was in the patient's chart, she said, during the deterioration window, from an administrative terminal. That's not... She stopped. Physicians access charts constantly. That alone proved nothing. But the administrative terminal, not a clinical one, the timing, the subsequent footage restriction, the pattern of it, laid against everything else she'd documented on the yellow legal pad in front of her. You need to tell Solis tonight, Deb said. Not in the morning, tonight. I will. And Claire, Deb stopped, started again. I should have said this a long time ago. I've been watching him do this for years, and I kept telling myself it was above my clearance level, and it wasn't my fight, and Her voice had gone rough around the edges. I'm going to testify. If they ask me to testify, I'm going to do it. Deb, I know the risk. I know what he does to people who go against him. I've seen it. A pause. But I watched that dog look at you, and I watched you work on that dog with your hands steady, and I thought, she's not afraid of him. Why am I still afraid of him? Claire closed her eyes for a moment, opened them. He suspended me, she said. He pulled the footage. He's going to spend the next 48 hours building a wall around himself that's going to take the IG months to dismantle. There's nothing uncomplicated about this. I know, Deb said. Call Solis. Solis answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting while Claire relayed everything Deb had told her. When Claire finished, the silence on the line lasted long enough to be meaningful. The footage restriction is a problem, Solis said. Can you override it? The federal request supersedes the internal restriction, in theory. In practice, Marcia's lawyers are going to argue the restriction was filed before the request was formally served, which is technically true by about 6 hours. Her voice was measured, but there was something underneath it, a tightening. The administrative chart access log is different. That's a system record, not a camera record. If Deb can get me a screenshot of that log, she pulled it before the restriction. A pause. She has it? She has the system log. I don't know if she can share it without... Tell her to contact me directly, tonight. Solis was moving. Claire could hear it. The shift of environment, a door, footsteps. If that log shows what you're describing, it changes the shape of the deposition tomorrow significantly. He's going to know she pulled it. Probably. Can she handle that? Claire thought about Deb's voice going rough around the edges. Watched him do this for years. Yes, she said. She can. Then get her my number. A brief pause. Miss Navarro, the footage restriction may actually help us. How? Because restricting footage that's the subject of an active federal records request is itself a potential obstruction issue. His lawyers filed fast. Too fast. Fast enough that they may not have fully thought through the implication of restricting evidence simultaneous with a federal inquiry. She paused again. If we can document the timeline precisely, request served, restriction filed, footage flagged, all within the same 6-hour window, that's a pattern a federal judge will want to look at. Claire set her pen down on the yellow legal pad. He moved too quickly, she said. Frightened people often do. Solis's voice was dry. Get me Deb's number. Get some sleep. Be here at 8 tomorrow. Oh, she did not get much sleep. At 6 a.m., she was sitting with coffee at the kitchen table, the legal pad full on both sides now, when her phone buzzed with a text from Wick. Solis got the log. It's worse than you thought. Come early. She arrived at the IG's field office, a deliberately unremarkable office suite in a building 3 blocks from Harlow General, at 7:15. Solis was already there, at a table covered in documents, looking like she'd been there for hours. 2 other people were in the room whom Claire hadn't met, both with the particular practiced stillness of people who processed evidence for a living. Solis looked up when Claire came in. Sit down. She sat. The system log Deb pulled shows 3 accesses to the Bay 4 chart from Marcia's administrative override code during the deterioration window. 3 separate accesses, 2 minutes apart. She turned a printout to face Claire. Look at the timestamps. Claire looked. The timestamps were precise. Administrative override access at 8:43 p.m., at 8:45 p.m., at 8:47 p.m. The crash cart was called at 8:51, she said. Correct. Solis's voice was flat and careful, the way voices get when the facts are speaking for themselves. An additional commentary would be a distraction. He was in that chart 4 minutes before the crash cart, from an administrative terminal, using an override code, not his clinical login. Why would he? She stopped. The answer assembled itself in the space of 3 seconds. Because the clinical login generated a provider of record annotation. It time-stamped the physician as an active treating party. The administrative override logged in access without creating that annotation. It let him see the chart without putting his name on the clinical record as the treating physician during the deterioration window. He was watching the patient's vitals through the chart, she said, and he logged it through the back door so there'd be no clinical record of him being in that case at that time. That's one interpretation, Solis said carefully. It's the interpretation that a federal prosecutor would. The door to the office opened. It was not a knock-first situation. The man who entered was in a uniform. Army, senior rank, the specific weight of insignia that meant decisions at a level above what was happening in this room. Colonel, the rank on his shoulder. Behind him, a younger officer, a JAG badge visible on the latter's jacket. Solis stood up. Colonel Faber, she said, which meant she'd been expecting him and hadn't mentioned it. The colonel looked at Claire. He was in his 60s, the particular build of someone who had been physically formidable once, and had not entirely conceded the point to age. His face was not unkind. It was also not here for pleasantries. You're Claire Navarro, he said. Yes. I served with the unit that conducted the extraction you were part of 11 years ago. He said it without ceremony, the way people state facts that have been facts for a long time. I have been aware of your record for a significant portion of that time. I have been attempting to locate the correct mechanism for a formal recognition that should have happened years earlier, which ran into classification issues that have since been resolved. He looked at the documents on the table, looked at Solis. I'm also here because the events at Harlow General Medical Center have now reached a level of federal interest that requires direct Army oversight. He pulled out a chair. I'd like to review what you have. Solis gestured to the table. The colonel sat down. He opened the first folder with the efficient motion of a man who read documents for consequence rather than detail. And for the next 22 minutes, the room was almost entirely quiet. When he finished, he looked at Claire. Dr. Marsh's lawyers contacted the hospital board at 6 a.m. this morning, he said. They're preparing a statement alleging that the veteran complaints being presented to the Inspector General's office were coordinated by a former employee with a personal grievance, specifically you, and that the documentation has been selectively assembled to support a predetermined narrative. She had expected this. And the hospital board is considering issuing a statement in support of that framing. He held her gaze. Which means that by this afternoon, the public story, the one outside this room, may be that you orchestrated this. The room absorbed that. The security footage, she said, restricted. The chart access log. Obtained without authorization by a hospital employee who may face disciplinary action for pulling it. He said it without judgment, just the way the terrain lay. Then what do we have? She asked. What you've always had. He closed the folder. Testimony, documentation. The log, which was obtained improperly but exists. And 9 veterans who will stand in front of a review board and say what they witnessed, at whatever personal cost that involves. He looked at her steadily. And a retired military working dog who identified you on a public sidewalk in front of witnesses. A pause. Which is admissible as behavioral evidence of prior significant contact in ways that matter to the record we're building. She thought about what Marsh was doing in the hospital across the street at this exact moment. The phone calls. The documentation being assembled to describe her as a disgruntled employee, a woman with a grievance, a nurse who overstepped. Just a nurse. She looked at Colonel Faber. When the board releases that statement, she said, what happens to the deposition? It becomes more important, he said, because at that point the question stops being administrative and starts being public. He looked at her without softening it. They're going to say you fabricated your military background. It's the next logical move. Discredit the witness. Discredit the record. The words landed with a specific weight. Then we need the extraction records, she said. They're classified. You said the classification issues were resolved. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not hesitation exactly, but the particular expression of a man holding two things of equal weight and determining which one was heavier. Some of them, he said carefully. The portion that covers your specific actions during the extraction. That portion has been cleared for disclosure in a federal proceeding. He paused. The full record, including the names and circumstances of everyone else involved, that remains restricted. I don't need the full record, Claire said. I need enough to establish that I was there, that what I've described is accurate, that the person Marsh's lawyers are going to call a disgruntled nurse with a fabricated backstory is the same person who— I know who you are, the colonel said quietly. I was there. The room went still. She looked at him. Not at the extraction site, he said. At the transport. I was the ranking officer who received the casualty report. He held her gaze. I signed the document that should have generated your formal commendation. It went into a classified file because of the nature of the operation, and He stopped. Something crossed his face that was not comfortable for him. I assumed it had been handled through another channel. I was wrong. The silence that followed was not the silence of a dramatic moment. It was more complicated than that. The silence of an error acknowledged by the person responsible for it, in a room full of people who understood what that error had cost. She breathed through it. Then you'll testify, she said. Yes. And you'll provide the extraction records. The declassified portion. Yes. He didn't look away. Ms. Navarro, I owe you an apology that is inadequate to what was left undone. I'm not going to dress it up. But what I can do is make sure that the record is complete before this is over. She nodded once. It was not forgiveness, and it was not absolution, and it was not the absence of anger. All of those things existed in some configuration inside her. But it was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement, in her experience, was where things could start to change. Her phone buzzed on the table. Wick's number. She answered. You need to see this, he said. Turn on the local news. She looked at Solis, who was already reaching for a laptop. Solis opened it, found the local news stream, and turned it so the room could see. On the screen, outside Harlow General Medical Center, a reporter was standing with a microphone, and behind her 2 men in suits were walking through the hospital's main entrance. Lawyers, the graphic identified them, from Harlow General's legal firm. And behind the lawyers, slightly to the left, moving toward the camera in the distance, was Elliot Marsh in his white coat. He was smiling. Not at the camera, at something to the left of the reporter, something not visible in the frame. But the smile was real, and it was the smile of a man who had made a move he was confident about. The caption under the footage read, Harlow General issues statement, suspended nurses' claims called unsubstantiated. And then, below that, in the secondary text line that news stations used for developing details, Hospital Board opens review into possible coordinated campaign against senior physician. Claire looked at the screen. She looked at her name in the secondary text line, reduced to suspended nurse, and she felt something move through her that was not quite anger. Anger was too simple for it. It was the compound emotion of someone who has been here before, in different circumstances, when the official narrative assembled itself around a truth it was trying to contain. She'd been dismissed before. She'd been reduced before. She'd also carried 3 people and a working dog through a fire zone in 4 minutes flat, and the man who was smiling at the camera right now had been accessing patient charts through an administrative back door while his patient deteriorated 4 minutes before a crash cart, and there was a colonel sitting at the table behind her who had signed the document that should have ended this kind of thing a decade ago. She turned from the screen. What's the fastest route to getting those extraction records into the federal record? She asked the colonel. I can file the declassification confirmation with Solis's office today, he said. It would be entered into the federal proceeding by end of business. Do it. She looked at Solis. And the chart access log, the one Deb pulled. What's the procedure for entering it, even given how it was obtained? If Deb files a formal witness declaration alongside it, detailing how and why she accessed it, it can be entered as evidence with appropriate notation. Solis's voice was precise. It doesn't get excluded. It gets contextualized. Get her on the phone. Claire looked at the laptop screen one more time. Marsh's white coat, his smile, the caption with her name in it. He just made a public statement, which means this is public now, which means the deposition record becomes public record. Yes, Solis said. Good. She pulled out her chair and sat back down. Then let's make sure the record is complete. She picked up her pen. Across the street, behind the glass of Harlow General Medical Center, in a building where his name was on the budget approvals and the staff evaluations and the quarterly reports, Elliot Marsh was telling a story about her to a camera. She was going to make sure that when the full record was read, by a review board, by a federal judge, by anyone who wanted to know what had actually happened in Bay 4 and in that lobby, and in 11 years of a combat medic's life, the story he was telling would not be the one that lasted. She began to write. And across the street, in the lobby of Harlow General, Priya, 26 years old, 8 months on the job, still terrified, walked up to the security desk and asked for the administrator on duty. In her hand was a USB drive. On that drive was footage she had copied from the Bay 4 external monitor log before the IT restriction went through. Not the camera feed, which required security clearance, but the vitals display log, which fed through the nursing station system she had full access to. Timestamp by timestamp. Pressure reading by pressure reading. 4 minutes before the crash cart. Priya had not told anyone she was going to do it. That was the part that struck Claire later. Not the footage itself, not the timestamps, not even the data it contained, but the fact that a 26-year-old nurse 8 months into her first job had made the decision alone, in the middle of the night, without anyone telling her it was the right move or that it would be safe or that it would matter. She had simply seen a window closing and walked through it before it shut. The vitals display log was not the camera footage. It did not show Marsh's face or his hands or his white coat moving through the corridor. What it showed was numbers. The GSW patient's blood pressure, oxygen saturation, heart rate, respiratory rate, logged at 30-second intervals by the monitoring system in Bay 4, captured simultaneously by the nursing station display that fed through the clinical network rather than the security camera network, which meant it had bypassed the IT restriction entirely. The restriction covered security camera feeds. It had not occurred to anyone, not to Marsh, not to his lawyers, to cover the nursing station display logs, because nursing station display logs were not, in the ordinary course of events, treated as evidentiary material. Priya had thought of it because she was the one who'd been watching those numbers in real time that night, standing in the bay, and she knew exactly what the log would show. What it showed? Blood pressure at 8:41 p.m. reading 84/52. At 8:43, 81/49. At 8:45, 79/47. The waveform notation, which the display system encoded as a quality indicator flag, shifting from acceptable to abnormal at 8:42 and holding that flag for 9 consecutive readings before the crash cart notation appeared in the log at 8:51. 9 readings, 9 30-second intervals, 4.5 minutes during which the patient's pressure dropped in a documented, time-stamped, irrefutable sequence, and during which, per the administrative access log Deb had pulled, Marsh's override code had been used to access that same patient's chart 3 times from a non-clinical terminal. He had watched it happen. That was what the 2 logs, read side by side, suggested. Not that he had caused it, not directly. The lawyers would spend considerable effort on that distinction, but that he had been aware of it in real time through the back channel of an administrative access, while clinically he appeared not to be involved in the case at all. Solis had both documents on the table within 40 minutes of Priya's appearance at the administrator's desk. The administrator, a different one from Holt, a man named Garrett, who had the look of someone who had been called in on his day off and was processing the situation with increasing alarm, had initially pushed back, citing data governance protocols, until Solis had placed her federal credentials on the desk beside the USB drive and said very evenly, "The governance protocol that applies here is mine." The drive was copied into the federal record at 10:17 a.m. At 11:03 a.m., Harlow General's legal counsel withdrew the countermotion challenging the federal records request. Wick texted Claire the news from the lobby of the IG field office, where he had been sitting with Atlas for the past 2 hours. Claire read the text at the deposition table, where she had been answering questions for 45 minutes, and she set the phone face down and kept going. The deposition was not cathartic the way people who haven't given depositions imagine it will be. It was methodical and exhausting and required a precision of language that meant she had to slow down every answer to make sure she was saying what was actually true rather than what felt true, which was harder than it sounded when the events in question covered 3 years of daily observation. The JAG officer conducting it, a sharp-faced woman named Captain Elise Noor, who asked questions with a scalpel rather than a hammer, moved through the timeline with the patience of someone who understood that the value of testimony was in the details that seemed minor until they connected to something else. When you say Dr. Marsh removed you from high-acuity cases, Captain Noor said, can you give me specific examples with approximate dates? Claire gave her 7. She had them written on the legal pad in front of her, dated to the best of her ability, with the patient's presenting condition and the stated reason she was given for the reassignment where she could recall it. In each of these cases, were you given a clinical reason for the reassignment? In 3 of them, yes. In the other 4, no reason was given. And in the cases where a reason was given? In 2 cases, I was told the case had been assigned to another nurse. In 1 case, I was told the bay was being reconfigured for a different procedure. Were any of those reasons accurate? The first 2 were accurate in the narrow sense that another nurse had been assigned. The reassignment decision itself, why it happened and on whose authority, that I don't have documentation for. She paused. The third one was not accurate. Bay 4 was not reconfigured that evening. I checked the bay log the following morning. Captain Noor wrote something. What did the bay log show? It showed Bay 4 was used for 2 standard intake evaluations that evening. No reconfiguration, no special procedure. Did you document that at the time? I documented my observation in a personal log, not through official channels. Why not official channels? This was the question she'd expected, and she answered it the same way she'd answered it in her head 100 times. Because the official complaint process at Harlow General routed through the department head's administrative review board, and the department head's administrative review board was chaired by the physician I would have been complaining about. Noor looked up from her notes. You're saying the internal complaint mechanism was structurally inaccessible to you. I'm saying it was structurally controlled by the person the complaint would have been about. Noor wrote something longer this time. Quote, the deposition ran until 1:30 p.m. When it ended, Claire sat in the chair for a moment after the recording equipment was turned off, not moving, the way you stay very still after holding a sustained physical effort to let your body figure out it can release now. Colonel Faber was waiting in the hallway. He handed her a paper cup of coffee without asking if she wanted it, which she appreciated. Noor is thorough, he said. Yes. The extraction records were entered into the federal proceeding at 9 this morning. He looked at her. All of it. Your name, your unit designation, the actions documented, the commendation that was drafted and never processed. She drank the coffee. It was bad coffee, the kind that comes from a machine that doesn't fully heat the water, and it was exactly what she needed. How long before Marsh's lawyers know what's in the record? She asked. They can request access in 48 hours. They'll request it immediately. And then? Then they'll know that the nurse they've been calling unsubstantiated has a classified extraction record that documents specific life-saving actions under fire, a commendation signed by a colonel who is now testifying on her behalf, and 11 years of medical practice with no disciplinary record prior to arriving at their client's facility. He looked at her steadily. Their statement this morning was filed before they knew any of that. They are going to have a significant problem. Claire held the paper cup in both hands. He doesn't know about the extraction records. No. He built his narrative around a nurse with a grievance. She looked at the wall across the hallway. Not a combat medic with a federal record. Correct. She stood up. Her back ached from the deposition chair, which had been the wrong height for her frame, and she had a headache that had started around the 2nd hour of testimony and had not resolved. She did not look like someone at the center of a federal proceeding. She looked like someone who had not slept enough and had been sitting in uncomfortable furniture for most of the day. What happens to Priya? She asked. She may face a data governance complaint from the hospital for accessing and copying the vitals log. It's possible. He paused. It's also possible that a nurse who preserved critical evidence by accessing data she was legitimately authorized to view through the nursing station system she operates daily. It's possible that argument holds. His lawyers will go after her. They'll try. He looked at her directly. She knew that when she did it. She thought about Priya in the deposition anteroom that morning, sitting in a chair with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression set in the particular way of someone who is resolved but not comfortable with their resolution. The lawyers had taken her statement for an hour before Claire's deposition started. Priya had come out of it pale and quiet and had sat beside Claire in the hallway without speaking for a few minutes. Then she'd said, "He kept asking me if you told me to pull the log." "What did you say?" "That you didn't know I had it until Wick texted you this morning." She'd looked at her hands. "Because that's true." "Yes," Claire had said. "It is." At 3:45 p.m., the federal records request, now uncontested after the withdrawal of the countermotion, was executed. This was not a quiet event. A records request of this scope, executed against a hospital, involved IT personnel, department administrators, and legal oversight. It required physical presence in the building. It required cooperation from staff who had been told by their department head that the process was being challenged and managed through proper channels. When it became clear instead that the proper channels had just opened directly into their server room, the response inside Harlow General took on the particular quality of an institution realizing the floor has shifted. Marsh was in a patient consultation when the IT director knocked on his office door at 3:52 and told him. He finished the consultation. This was noted later as a small thing, but noted. He finished it calmly, professionally, and then walked to his office and closed the door. The IT director, who had expected something other than calm professionalism, stood outside the door for a moment and then went back to coordinating the record's handover. At 4:18 p.m., Harlow General's legal counsel contacted Solis's office to discuss the scope of the request. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. What was communicated during those 11 minutes, Claire learned from Wick, was that counsel had reviewed the federal record entries made that morning, the extraction documents, the deposition summary, the dual log evidence from Priya and Deb, and was now operating with a significantly different understanding of the situation than they had been at 6 a.m. when they filed their client's statement. The statement calling her claims unsubstantiated was still on the hospital's website at 4:18. By 4:55, it was gone. Wick texted her a screenshot of the removal timestamp. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Atlas, who was asleep on the floor beside her chair in the IG field office, with the deep, uncomplicated sleep of an old dog who has decided this location is acceptable. And she thought about Marsh in his office behind a closed door, and she felt something she identified after a moment as not triumph, not yet, but the specific relief of a structure that has been bearing weight for too long, finally having some of that weight shifted elsewhere. The board meeting was called for the following morning. Harlow General's board of directors, 7 members, convened at 8 a.m. in the same fourth-floor conference room where Claire had sat across from Patricia Holt 2 days earlier. Claire was not present for this meeting. She was not invited. She learned what happened in it from 2 sources. Deb, who had been asked to provide a witness account to the board and was in the building for that purpose, and Solis, who received a summary briefing afterward. What happened was this. The board reviewed the federal record entries. They reviewed the dual log evidence. They reviewed the extraction records and the commendation document signed by Colonel Faber, and they reviewed the deposition transcript, and they reviewed the veteran case files that Wick had presented 2 days earlier in that same room. They also reviewed something that had not been publicly part of the proceedings until that morning, a supplemental report from Solis's office documenting 6 additional cases over a 4-year period in which patient chart access through Marsh's administrative override code correlated with clinical decisions that could not be accounted for by his listed treating physician status. 6 cases. 2 with adverse outcomes, 1 a delayed diagnosis, 1 a medication error that had been attributed to nursing staff, and that the supplemental report now suggested had been preceded by an unauthorized administrative chart access at a clinically significant moment. The medication error case had resulted in a formal complaint from the patient's family 2 years earlier. The complaint had been reviewed by the hospital's internal quality committee. The quality committee's finding, issued 6 weeks after the complaint was filed, had been that the error was the result of a communication breakdown between nursing staff and pharmacy. The chair of the quality committee that had issued that finding was Elliot Marsh. Deb told her this over the phone at 9:47 a.m., her voice doing the thing it did when she was trying to keep it level and not entirely succeeding. He reviewed his own case, she said. He was the physician whose chart access preceded the error, and he chaired the committee that ruled it was nursing staff communication. Claire was sitting in her car outside the IG field office. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of West Virginia autumn morning that had a specific quality of light. Low, long, cutting across surfaces at an angle that made everything look slightly more defined than usual. "Who was on nursing staff at the time?" she asked. "A travel nurse. She didn't come back for the second contract." "Do you know her name?" "Jenna Watts. She's working in Pittsburgh now. I found her this morning." Deb paused. "She'll talk." "Tell Solis." "Already did." A pause. "Claire, the board is still in session. But Patricia Holt came out 20 minutes ago, and she looked—" Deb stopped. "She looked like someone who just found out the building she's been managing has a structural problem she should have caught years ago. She went to the fourth-floor bathroom, and she was in there for 15 minutes. She didn't know," Claire said. "Not as a defense of Holt, just as an assessment of probability." "I don't think she did. Not the full shape of it." Deb's voice had gone quieter. "He kept it very compartmentalized. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Every piece of it was in a different silo. The complaint routing through his committee, the chart access through the override code nobody audited, the staff removals framed as reassignments. None of it visible end to end unless you were standing inside it every day and paying very close attention. Or unless you pulled it all out and laid it side by side," Claire said, "which is what the IG did." A pause. "The board is going to move today. I don't know how far, but they're going to move." She was right about that. The board's decision came at 12:34 p.m., communicated first to Marsh through the hospital's general counsel, and then, within the hour, through a formal administrative action entered into the hospital's record. Immediate suspension of clinical privileges pending a comprehensive administrative and patient safety review, removal from the emergency medicine department chair, and appointment of an interim department head effective immediately. It was not an arrest. It was not a criminal finding. It was a board-level administrative action, which was the most that a board could do unilaterally, and Marsh's lawyers would contest it. They had already indicated as much in a call to the general counsel that lasted 23 minutes and accomplished nothing except documenting that the contest had been registered. But the clinical suspension meant his badge no longer opened the department. His administrative override code was deactivated. The office with the framed certificates was, by end of business, accessible only to a facilities manager with a lockbox key. Wick called her when the action was confirmed. "It's not everything," he said. "No," she agreed. "The IG review will take months. The criminal referral, if Solis pursues one, will take longer." "I know." "But he's out of the building." She was standing at the window of the IG field office, looking at Harlow General across the street. She could see the ambulance bay from this angle, the overhang where she'd passed Sergeant Wick and Bravo 3 nights ago in the rain, a lifetime ago in the compressed calendar of the past 72 hours. "Deb texted me," she said. "The nursing staff found out about an hour ago. She said the break room was—" She paused, looking for the word. "Relieved," Wick offered. "Yes." She looked at the building. "Relieved." "And Priya?" Priya cried for about 10 minutes and then went back to work. She said it with the particular warmth of someone who found that very specifically right. "She's going to be fine." "And the travel nurse, Watts, in Pittsburgh?" "Solis is contacting her today. If she's willing to give a statement, it goes into the supplemental record." She turned from the window. "That case is the one that turns administrative misconduct into something with different consequences." "Meaning criminal." "Meaning if he reviewed his own case and buried the complaint, and the evidence supports that the error was related to his unauthorized chart access? Yes." She paused. "That's not my call to make. It's Solis's." "But you think she'll make it?" "I think the evidence is going to make it for her." She sat down. Atlas, who had been sleeping under the table, lifted his head at the sound of her chair, looked at her, determined everything was acceptable, and put his head back down. "There's something you should know," Wick said. His voice shifted. Not serious suddenly. It had been serious, but differently serious. The kind of shift that precedes something personal rather than procedural. "Tell me." "The commendation document. The one Faber submitted this morning." He paused. There's a ceremony that goes with it. Formal recognition, military honors. There's a process. I know the process. Faber wants to do it here, in Harlow Falls, not at a base, not at a ceremony venue. Here. Another pause. He thinks it matters where it happens. She thought about that. About the ambulance bay and the lobby, and the conference room on the 4th floor and the nursing station where she'd stood for 3 years, watching a man remove her from the cases where she was most needed. When? She asked. That's your call, Wick said. It always was. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the light was moving, midday to afternoon, the angle shifting in the particular way of autumn light that never stays where it starts. After the review is complete, she said. After the record is closed and the findings are final. She paused. I don't want a ceremony while the outcome is still in question. I want it when there's nothing left to question. That's fair, Wick said. I'll tell him. That's what she had not anticipated, what no one had fully anticipated, including Solis, who had been doing this work for 15 years, was how quickly the supplemental report moved once Jenna Watts gave her statement. It took 9 days. Watts was now 31, working pediatric emergency in Pittsburgh, and she answered Solis's call on the second ring and gave her statement over video deposition 3 days after the board action against Marsh. She was precise in the way that trauma nurses are precise, not dramatized, just accurate, and she described in detail the medication error case, the chart she had accessed, the order she had followed, the documentation she had completed, and the quality committee hearing 8 weeks later in which a man she had met exactly once had reviewed her performance and found her conduct to be the primary contributing factor. She had not contested the finding. She had completed her contract and not returned. Did anyone follow up with you after the finding was issued? Solis asked during the deposition. No, Watts said. I received a copy of the report. That was it. Did anyone from the hospital's administration contact you to discuss the findings? No. Did you receive any information suggesting that chart access prior to the error had been reviewed as part of the quality investigation? No. The investigation was entirely focused on my documentation and communication with pharmacy. The chart access piece, I didn't know that was even a variable until you called me. The deposition was 43 minutes long. Solis submitted it to the IG record within hours. 6 days after that, on a Thursday morning, Claire's phone rang at 7:15. It was Solis. Criminal referral, Solis said. Filed this morning with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of West Virginia. Counts include obstruction of a federal investigation, falsification of medical records for the purposes of concealing a patient safety violation, and fraudulent conduct in the exercise of administrative authority. She paused. He'll be arrested today. Claire was standing in her kitchen. The morning light was coming through the west-facing window at the angle it came in October, the specific angle that reached the back of the counter and lit up the grain of the wood in a way she usually didn't pay attention to. She paid attention to it now. Today, she said. Federal agents are at the hospital at 8. Solis's voice was measured. I'm telling you ahead of time because you should hear it from me, not from the news. Will he know it's coming? His lawyers were notified at 6:30 this morning. Standard process. A pause. He has about 90 minutes. She thought about what 90 minutes felt like. She thought about what it had felt like to stand outside his office door after he'd dismissed her, in the rain, with a tremor in her right hand. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Solis said. The legal process from here is long, and it's not going to be linear, and his lawyers are good. But the referral is filed, and the federal record is what it is, and that part, a brief pause. That part doesn't change. The call ended. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she put her coat on, picked up her keys, and drove to Harlow General. She didn't go inside. She parked across the street, in the same parking lot where the coffee shop was, and she sat in the car. Atlas was not with her. He had gone back with his handler 2 days earlier, and the absence of his weight beside her chair was something she was still adjusting to, a quiet that had a specific shape to it. At 8:03 a.m., 2 federal vehicles pulled into the hospital's main entrance. 4 agents, civilian clothes, moving with the efficiency of people executing a planned action. They went through the front doors. She could not see what happened inside. She sat in the car and watched the entrance and the parking structure and the ambulance bay and the ordinary machinery of the hospital's morning Transport vehicles, visitors, nurses changing shifts, the world that had continued operating regardless of everything that had happened inside it. At 8:31 a.m., Elliot Marsh came through the front doors. He was in civilian clothes, not his white coat. That was the first thing she noticed, the absence of it, after 19 years. He was walking between two agents, not cuffed, which was procedure for this type of arrest, with legal counsel present, and his lawyers were beside him, and his face was, she searched for the word, still, not calm, not the pleasant mask expression she'd catalogued over 3 years, still in the specific way of a face that has run out of the processing capacity needed to produce an expression. He moved through the entrance and down the steps and toward the vehicle, and he did not look around, did not look at the faces of the nursing staff she could see gathering near the lobby windows. He did not look across the street. She watched until the vehicle pulled out of the entrance drive and turned onto the main road and disappeared from sight. Then she sat for a while longer. Her phone buzzed. Deb, we're watching from the break room. Priya is holding it together. I am less successfully holding it together. Then, you should come inside. She looked at the text. She looked at the hospital entrance. She had been suspended from that building 9 days ago. Her badge was inactive. The administrative leave was still, technically, in process. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize. She answered. Ms. Navarro? A man's voice, composed, with the register of someone accustomed to speaking in formal situations. This is Warren Aldridge. I'm the board chair of Harlow General Medical Center. A pause. I'm calling to inform you that effective immediately, your administrative leave has been revoked and your employment reinstated with full back pay for the suspension period. Another pause, in which something that might have been discomfort moved through his delivery. The board would also like to request a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss your continued role at this institution. She looked at the hospital entrance. I'll need some time, she said, before that meeting. Of course, Aldridge said. Whatever you need. She thanked him and ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand. Reinstatement. Back pay. A meeting at her convenience. 9 days ago, she had been suspended in writing by a man who had just been walked out of his own building by federal agents. The distance between those 2 points was not a straight line. It was 9 days of depositions and evidence logs and a colonel who owed her a decade-late apology and a 26-year-old nurse who had copied a USB drive in the middle of the night because she was paying attention to the right thing. She put the car in drive. She was halfway to the entrance when her phone buzzed one more time. Not a call. A text from Wick with an attachment. She pulled into a parking space and opened it. It was a photograph. Not old. Dated this morning. Time-stamped 40 minutes ago. It showed a room she didn't recognize, a clinical space with the particular organization of a working veterinary facility, and in the center of the photograph, on a padded mat, was Atlas. He was not alone. Beside him, curled against his side in the way of an animal who has found something warm and has made a decision about it, was a younger dog, a German shepherd, maybe 18 months. The dark mask and alert ears of a dog who had not yet learned patience, but was currently being very patient because the old dog beside him had a quality that made patience seem like the right choice. The text from Wick read, Bravo got out of surgery yesterday. His handler brought him to visit Atlas this morning. They've been like this for 2 hours. The vet says Bravo is going to be fine. She sat with the photograph for a long moment. Then she put the phone in her pocket, got out of the car, and walked toward Harlow General's main entrance. The automatic doors opened. Inside, at the nursing station visible from the entrance corridor, Deb was standing with her arms crossed, watching the door. When she saw Claire, she uncrossed her arms and her expression did something complicated that did not resolve into a single readable emotion, which was exactly right for the moment. Priya was beside her. Priya saw Claire and her face did the thing faces do when a specific tension releases. Not joy exactly, just the end of the particular bracing quality that comes from not knowing how something will resolve. Claire walked toward them. She was almost at the nursing station when her eye caught something, a movement past the station in the corridor that led toward the administrative wing. A facilities manager with a cart moving toward the corner office, the lockbox key on his belt. She watched him for a moment. Then she turned back to the station, to Deb and Priya, to the nursing station that smelled of hand sanitizer and old coffee, and had the persistent hum of the HVAC system she'd learned to tune out 3 years ago. "The board wants a meeting," she said. "What kind of meeting?" Deb asked. "The kind where they want to know what I want." She set her bag on the desk. She looked around the department, the bays, the monitors, the supply carts, the corridor where she'd been told to leave cases she should have stayed on. "Which means I need to figure out what I want." "What do you want?" Priya asked. Honest question, no subtext. Claire thought about it. She thought about the past 9 days and the 3 years before them and the 11 years before those. She thought about what the department could be if the person running it thought patient outcomes were the metric rather than administrative convenience. She thought about the veteran patients who had come through this building and been rerouted through committees that served the committee chair's interests. She thought about Deanna Marsh, no relation, sitting quietly in a conference room, describing a diagnosis that had been missed. "I want a trauma program," she said. "Veteran-specific intake protocol. Staff trained in service-connected condition identification. I want it run correctly, and I want it built from the beginning the right way." She looked at Deb. "And I want you as charge nurse, same as you are now, but with the complaint routing structure fixed so it doesn't go through any single department head." Deb looked at her for a moment. "You've been thinking about this?" "For about a week," Claire said, while simultaneously being the center of a federal investigation. "People can multitask." Deb's mouth did something at the corner. Not quite a smile. Closer to the expression someone makes when a thing lands correctly after a long time landing wrong. "The board meeting," she said. "When?" "I'll call Aldridge tomorrow." Claire picked up her bag. "Tonight I'm going home and sleeping for approximately 11 hours. She was at the door of the department, hand on the frame, when Priya said quietly, "Claire." She turned. Priya was holding something, a folded piece of paper, the kind that came from the hospital's internal mail system. "This came to the nursing station this morning, before everything. It's addressed to you." She crossed back and took it. She unfolded it. It was a printout of an email. The sender's address was a government domain she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Records Disclosure. Action Pending. Navarro. C. File reference 7741M." The body of the email was 3 sentences, bureaucratic in the way of government correspondence that was trying to communicate something significant without using language that could be mischaracterized. She read it twice. Then she stood very still for a moment, the paper in her hand, the department sounds around her. "What is it?" Priya asked. Claire looked at the paper one more time. "Read the 3rd sentence again." The 3rd sentence indicated that, in the review of materials submitted to the federal record, a secondary file associated with her extraction case had been identified that had not been included in the initial declassification request. A file that, the email stated, contained additional documentation of actions during the extraction event and the names of individuals who had submitted formal statements on her behalf at the time. Statements she had never been told existed. Statements that had been filed by people who survived that night and had apparently, in the weeks and months after, tried to make sure what she had done was on record somewhere, and had been told, each of them, that the record was classified, that the commendation process was ongoing, that the paperwork was being handled. For 11 years. She folded the paper, put it in her pocket. "Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow," she said, and walked out of the department. She was in the stairwell, one flight down, when she sat on the step and put her head in her hands, and let herself do the things she hadn't done in 9 days, hadn't done in 11 years, hadn't done since she'd walked off a transport with burns she didn't mention and told herself the chapter was closed. She sat there for 3 minutes. Then she stood up, squared her shoulders, and walked down to the ground floor and out into the October light, which was cutting low and long across everything, making the ordinary surfaces of the parking lot and the street and the hospital building look, just for a moment, like they were made of something more than what they were. The October light followed her to her car and stayed there while she sat in the driver's seat with the folded email in her lap and did not start the engine. Statements, filed by people who had survived that night. She had always known, in the abstract way that people know things they cannot verify, that some of them had made it. Wick had told her about Kellerman. The transport manifest had been classified, so she hadn't had names, hadn't had outcomes, hadn't had the ability to trace what happened to the people she'd moved through the smoke. For 11 years she had operated on the assumption that they were alive somewhere, living lives she had no access to, and that this was the correct relationship to have with something that was over. The email said they had tried to reach her through the paperwork, through the formal commendation process that had stalled and been rerouted and eventually disappeared into a classified file. They had put their names on statements that said what she had done, and those statements had sat in a folder in a system she didn't know existed, and none of it had reached her. She sat with that for a while. Not with grief. The feeling was more complicated than grief. It was something closer to the sensation of finding a room in a house you've lived in for years, a room you didn't know was there, and standing in the doorway understanding that the house was always larger than you thought. She drove home. She did sleep, not 11 hours, but 6 solid ones, which was more than she'd managed in a week. And when she woke, the apartment was dark and the radiator was knocking, and she felt, not better exactly, but present in a way she hadn't been for a while. She made actual food, eggs, toast, the kind of unremarkable meal that is its own form of self-correction. And she sat at the kitchen table and read the email again in full. The file reference number, the government domain, the 3 sentences, the third of which had stopped her in the hospital corridor and sent her to the stairwell to sit on a step for the first time in 11 years. In the morning, she called Solis. The secondary file was released to her within 72 hours of the formal request, processed under the same declassification authority Colonel Faber had used for the extraction records. It arrived as a scanned document package, 41 pages, sent to the secure email address. Solis's office had set up for her during the deposition process. She opened it on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table with coffee she actually drank. There were 7 statements, 7 people, different units, different ranks, different roles on the night of the extraction. Some of them she recognized by name, Dario, the soldier who had insisted on holding his own IV bag while she carried him, who turned out to be a specialist named Dario Fuentes, now 37, living in Albuquerque. Some she didn't recognize at all, names attached to descriptions of actions she remembered but hadn't known who witnessed. Each statement was different in tone and length, and the particular way the writer used language, because people are different, and the only thing uniform about them was that each one described in its own words what she had done and what it had meant. One of them, 4 pages, written in the careful handwriting of someone who had taken their time, was from Kellerman. Filed 14 months after the extraction, 8 months before he died. She read it twice. She set it on the table. She looked at the wall across the kitchen for a while. Then she turned the page and kept reading. She called Wick that afternoon. "Fuentes," she said. "Dario Fuentes. Is he reachable?" A brief pause. "I know him. He's in New Mexico. He's got a landscaping business." "Why?" "He filed a statement. I want to thank him." "I can get you his number." Another pause, different in texture. "There are others, Claire, in the file. Some of them have been hoping you'd call." She looked at the stack of 41 pages on the table. "I know." "Are you ready for that?" She considered the question honestly, which was the only way it was worth considering. "No," she said, "but I'm going to do it anyway." "That's what brave actually is," Wick said, and she recognized her own words and didn't say anything for a moment. "The ceremony," she said. "Colonel Faber. When he's ready." "He's been ready for 11 years. "Schedule it." She paused. "And Wick? I want the veterans there. The ones who came to the hospital, and Priya and Deb." Another pause. "And Atlas. Atlas will need his handler." "Then bring his handler." The criminal case against Elliot Marsh moved with the specific grinding pace of federal proceedings, which is to say it moved slowly and without drama, which was appropriate because the drama had already happened, and what remained was the machinery of consequence doing its work. He was released on bail the day of his arrest, which was expected. His lawyers filed motions and countermotions and issued public statements that became progressively more carefully worded as the evidence record deepened, and the progressive carefulness of the statements was, in its own way, a kind of documentation of how the terrain was shifting beneath him. The travel nurse's case, Jenna Watts, the medication error, the quality committee, became the anchor of the criminal referral in the way that secondary evidence sometimes becomes the center of a case because it is the clearest. The falsification count attached to that specific incident was supported by the administrative access log, the deposition, Watts's statement, and the quality committee's own records, which the federal records request had pulled, and which showed, in Marsh's own documented language, findings that could not be reconciled with the evidence now on record. His lawyers negotiated. Federal prosecutors considered. This was the process. Not a courtroom confrontation, not a dramatic verdict, but a series of incremental legal decisions made in offices and on phone calls, each one moving in a direction that could not be reversed. 3 months after his arrest, Marsh accepted a plea agreement. The terms were public record. 2 counts: falsification of administrative records and obstruction of a federal investigation. His medical license was surrendered as part of the agreement. He would not practice medicine again. The financial penalties were substantial. He was not going to prison, which was the part that sat uncomfortably with people, and Solis told Claire directly, "I know it's not everything, but his license is gone. His administrative authority is gone. The patients he affected, their records have been corrected and their cases have been reviewed. That part is complete." Claire had been sitting in the IG field office when Solis told her this, in the same chair where she'd given the deposition, and she had looked at the wall for a moment before answering. "The nursing staff at that facility," she said, "the ones who were pushed out. Is there any mechanism for—" "The settlement includes a restitution component directed at affected staff. The hospital's board negotiated it separately from the criminal case." Solis looked at her. "It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's documented. And Jenna Watts? She knows." A pause. "She said she didn't want money. She wanted it on the record that it wasn't her fault." Claire was quiet. "Is it on the record?" she asked. "Explicitly. The quality committee finding was formally vacated. Her personnel file has been corrected." Solis looked at her directly. "She asked me to tell you that. She said she didn't know your name until I called her, but she wanted you to know that whatever you started, it fixed something that had been wrong for 2 years." The wall across the room was the same unremarkable institutional wall it had always been. Claire looked at it. "Okay," she said, not as acceptance of inadequacy, more as the acknowledgement of something landing in the correct place after a long time in the wrong one. The board meeting happened on a Wednesday in November, 3 weeks after the plea agreement was entered. Warren Aldridge was a careful man who had been board chair for 6 years and had, in Claire's assessment, genuinely not known the full shape of what Marsh had built inside the institution he was responsible for overseeing. This did not excuse the oversight. It was also true. She held both of those things without resolving them into a simpler version of either. There were 5 board members in the room. Patricia Holt was there as administrator. 2 department heads Claire knew professionally. A legal representative. She brought Wick. She hadn't told the board she was doing that. Wick sat to her left and said nothing unless directly addressed, which was twice, and both times briefly and accurately. She presented the program proposal she had been drafting since the morning after the arrest. The veteran-specific intake protocol, the staff training structure, the complaint routing mechanism that removed single-point administrative control from the process. She had written it across 12 days, in the mornings before work and the evenings after, pulling from 3 years of direct observation and from the veteran case files she'd reviewed during the IG proceedings, and from a conversation she'd had with Deanna Marsh, no relation, in which Deanna had described, quietly and without bitterness, what she had needed at intake that she had not received. The proposal was 22 pages. She presented it in 40 minutes. She answered questions for another 30. Aldridge looked at the proposal. He looked at Claire. "This is a significant structural change to how we operate the emergency department." "Yes," she said. "The staffing requirements alone are detailed in the appendix with projected costs and a phased implementation timeline." She looked at him steadily. "The cost of not doing it has already been paid. By patients, by staff, by this institution's liability exposure. I'm proposing a structure that makes those costs less likely going forward." A silence. "Who would lead the program?" Holt asked. "I would," Claire said, "in a clinical director capacity. With Deb Forsyth as charge nurse and operational lead," she paused, "and with Priya Anand in a training development role. She's the right person for it." Aldridge looked at the proposal for a moment. "We'd need to discuss this with legal." "I know," Claire said. "I'm not asking for a decision today. I'm asking for a conversation that takes the proposal seriously." He looked up. Something in his expression had shifted. Not dramatically, not the movie version of a man having a moment of recognition. Just the slight adjustment of someone who has recalibrated their read on who they're dealing with. "We'll take it seriously," he said. She believed him. Not completely. She had worked in institutions long enough to know that believing completely was a different kind of mistake. But enough. The formal recognition ceremony was held on a Friday in December, on the front steps of Harlow General Medical Center. The choice of location had been Colonel Faber's suggestion, and Claire had agreed to it for reasons she couldn't fully articulate except that it mattered where things happened. It mattered that the building that had held the weight of the past 3 years, the corridor where she'd been told to remove herself from Bay 4, the office with the framed certificates, the nursing station where she'd stood and watched a man dismantle what she built case by case, that this building was the backdrop, that the story completed in the same space where it had been most broken. It was cold. December in West Virginia was not ceremonial weather, and nobody pretended otherwise. People wore coats. Breath showed. The steps were slightly damp from an earlier frost, and someone had put down non-slip matting in a way that was practical rather than decorative, which felt correct. Colonel Faber was in full-dress uniform. The JAG officer, Captain Noor, was there. Agent Solis stood to one side in her gray blazer with a different blazer underneath for the cold, which was the kind of detail that was very human and real. Wick was there, and the 9 veterans who had walked through those doors 6 weeks earlier, and Deb, who was wearing the expression of someone holding themselves together with precision, and Priya, who was not holding it together as much and had given up the effort and was simply letting her face do what it did. Atlas was there. He was on his handler's left, sitting in the specific upright posture of a working dog at attention, though he had been retired for 4 years, and the posture was muscle memory rather than duty. His muzzle was very gray in the December light. The left hind leg, the one that had taken the fragment 11 years ago, was held with the slight compensating angle of an old injury, well healed but present. When Claire came through the hospital's front doors and down the steps, Atlas stood. He did not rush. He was old, and he did not rush. But he stood and oriented toward her in the unhurried, certain way he had done on the sidewalk 6 weeks earlier, and he walked to her with the deliberate purpose of an animal for whom this moment was not complicated. She put her hand on his head. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. The handler, the young man, whose name was Corporal Reeves, and who had cared for Atlas for 2 years with evident and genuine affection, looked at the two of them and then looked at the middle distance, which was the right thing to do. Faber stepped forward. The commendation citation was read aloud by Captain Noor, and Claire stood and listened to her own name in the language of official record, rank, unit, date, actions taken, and the language was formal and precise and did not capture the smoke or the weight or the 4 minutes of a night she had spent 11 years trying to close a door on. And it didn't need to, because the language of official record is not the same as the language of what happened, and both things can be true simultaneously. When Noor finished reading, Faber stepped forward and pinned the commendation. He said quietly enough that only Claire heard it. "I should have made sure this reached you 11 years ago. I didn't. That's on me." He held her gaze. "It's on the record now." "Yes," she said. "It is." He stepped back. Noor stepped back, and then Wick stepped forward, and the 9 veterans with him, and they did not come with more official language. They came with a box. It was a document box, the plain archival kind, and Wick set it on the step beside her and opened it, and inside were printed pages, photographs, letters, cards. And she looked at the top page and saw Dario Fuentes' handwriting, which she recognized from the 41-page file, even though she'd never met him in person, and below that, a photograph of a man in his 30s standing in front of a landscaping truck in New Mexico sunshine with 2 kids and a dog, and a note clipped to it that said, "The medic who brought me home. I wanted you to see what home looked like." She picked up the photograph. Below it, another one. A woman in civilian clothes, a veteran she didn't recognize, whose statement in the file had been 3 pages describing being carried through the secondary collapse point, and whose photograph showed her at what appeared to be a college graduation, cap and gown, the particular exhausted joy of someone who has finished a very long thing. The note said, "I went back to school after I got out. I thought you should know I graduated, page by page, photograph by photograph." Not all of them were happy. Some of the letters described hard years. injuries that didn't fully heal, transitions that were rocky, losses that came later. They were honest in the way that real things are honest, without cleaning up the parts that didn't resolve neatly. One letter, from a man she didn't recognize but whose name matched a name in the file, said simply, "I'm not sure what you'd want to hear from me. I had a hard decade. I'm doing better now. I wanted you to know I'm still here. I'm still here." She held the box for a long time while the December cold moved across the steps, and nobody rushed her. An Atlas stood beside her right knee with his gray muzzle and his slightly compensating hip and his complete, undemanding presence. She spoke briefly because she was not a person who made speeches, and this was not a moment that needed one. She looked at the people on those steps, the veterans, Wick, Deb with her precise composure, Priya, who had given up on composure entirely, Solis in her doubled blazer, Colonel Faber with his expression of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and is setting it down. And she said, "I spent a long time thinking that what happened out there was over, that it was a closed chapter and the people who came after it were all I had access to, and I was wrong about that." She paused. Not wrong to move forward, wrong to think that moving forward meant the past had nothing left to say. She looked at the box in her hands. These people, she meant the letters, the photographs, the handwriting she'd read by morning light at a kitchen table. They didn't forget. They tried to reach me, and the system failed them the same way it failed me. And the fact that we're standing here instead of... She looked at the building behind her, the front of it, the glass where the nursing staff had gathered. Instead of in there, with that structure still in place, is because a lot of people made hard choices in the right direction. She looked at Priya specifically, including people who had every reason not to. Priya pressed her lips together and nodded once, which was the most she was going to manage. "I'm not a person who likes ceremonies," Claire said. "I want to be honest about that. This is uncomfortable and it's cold and it matters anyway." She paused. "The program we're building in that building is going to matter more than the ceremony. The intake protocols and the complaint routing and the training, that's where the story actually continues. That's where the work is." She looked at the box one more time. "But today, I'm glad I know. I'm glad I got to see what happened to the people who came after that night." She stopped. "That's all I've got." Faber looked at her. "That's enough," he said. The program was approved by the board in February, after 6 weeks of legal review and 2 rounds of amendment that were mostly administrative adjustments to the budget structure. The vote was unanimous, which Patricia Holt told Claire afterward, was not something she had seen in 8 years on the board. Deb became operational lead for the new intake protocol with the particular efficiency of someone who had been watching the wrong structure operate for years and had specific ideas about what the right one looked like. She didn't always agree with Claire's ideas, which was fine. The disagreements were usually productive and occasionally heated and always resolved into something better than either starting position, which was exactly the kind of working relationship Claire had not had in 3 years and had missed without knowing she was missing it. Priya took the training development role and turned out to be extraordinarily good at it in a way that surprised everyone except Claire, who had watched her hand equipment across a floor to someone she'd never worked with before and understood immediately what that kind of attentiveness could build. The veteran intake protocol was in operation by April. By June, 3 staff members from other departments had asked to cross-train. By September, a letter arrived from a veteran patient who had been through the new intake process, a man in his 50s, 2 tours, presenting with symptoms that the new protocol caught and correctly identified and referred appropriately, who said that for the first time in 8 years of civilian medical care, he had felt like the person treating him understood what they were looking at. Claire read the letter in her office, a small one, functional, no framed certificates on the wall. And then she put it in a folder she had started for exactly this kind of thing, and she went back to the clinical floor. Marcia's sentencing happened on a Tuesday in April, 6 months after the plea agreement. She did not attend. She had no obligation to be there, and no desire to perform an emotion for a proceeding that was going to proceed regardless of her presence. Wick texted her the sentence when it was handed down. 3 years probation, permanent license revocation, substantial financial penalties, mandatory compliance reporting for 5 years. No prison time, which was the part that the nursing staff discussed in the break room with varying degrees of frustration, and Claire's own view on it was that the permanent license revocation was the consequence that mattered most because it was the one that removed the mechanism. He could not practice. He could not chair committees. He could not access a chart through an administrative override code and watch a patient deteriorate from a back-channel terminal. That part was over. Jenna Watts in Pittsburgh sent a brief text to Solis that Solis forwarded to Claire. Good. Now I don't have to think about it anymore. That, Claire thought, was exactly the right response. Atlas died in late October of the following year, 14 months after he stood on the steps of Harlow General in the December cold and held his slightly compensating hip straight and put his gray muzzle against her right thigh. He died at the veterinary facility in Morgantown, in his sleep, on a Saturday morning, with Corporal Reeves beside him. Reeves called Wick, and Wick called Claire, and Claire sat in her office at Harlow General with the phone in her hand for a while after the call ended. She had seen Atlas 4 more times after the ceremony. Reeves had brought him to Harlow Falls twice, and twice she had driven to Morgantown, and each time was the same, Atlas orienting toward her as she entered, the deliberate movement, the weight of his head against her hand. He had slowed considerably in the last visits. The hip that compensated more, the sleep that came faster, the patience that had always been there becoming something quieter, more complete. The last time she had seen him, 3 weeks before he died, he had put his head in her lap in the facility's visitation room and gone to sleep there with the particular trust of an old animal who has decided there is no more pressing thing to be doing. She had sat very still for 40 minutes, so as not to disturb him, which was the most still she had been in a long time. She thought about what Reeves had told her once, about working dogs and memory. Not the way humans remembered, not narrative and sequential, but something more immediate. Presence recognized. Safety registered. The specific quality of a person coded into whatever part of the brain filed things worth returning to. 11 years. Atlas had carried that toward her across a hospital lobby in the particular way of something that had been waiting without urgency, without expectation, simply available. She took the afternoon off work. She drove to the overlook at Ridgecrest Park, which was 30 minutes outside Harlow Falls, and had the particular quality of West Virginia mountain light in late October. The trees bare enough to see through, the valley visible below, the sky doing what October skies do in that part of the country, which was everything at once. She sat on a bench at the overlook with her hands in her pockets and looked at the view for a while. She thought about what the view meant to her, which was not a question she would have asked herself a year earlier. She thought about the letters in the box, and Dario Fuentes with his kids and his dog in New Mexico sunshine, and the veteran who was still here, and Jenna Watts who didn't have to think about it anymore, and Priya in a training session down the hall from her office right now, explaining to 6 cross-training nurses how to read the specific presentation of traumatic brain sequelae in veterans who had learned to minimize their symptoms. She thought about what it cost to minimize things, the energy it required, the sustained effort of making yourself smaller than you were so that other people could remain comfortable with the size they'd decided you were. She had done it for 3 years. She had done it in different ways for longer than that. Not because she lacked confidence, she had never lacked confidence in what she knew how to do, but because the structure around her had been built to make the cost of not minimizing higher than the cost of minimizing, and she had made the calculation the structure was designed to produce. She did not regret the choices she had made inside that calculation. She had kept her job. She had kept watching. She had kept building the documentation, quietly, case by case, year by year, that ultimately constituted the record that an IG agent read in a diner on Callaway Street and decided was worth pursuing. The patience of it had not been weakness. The silence of it had not been surrender. It was the particular strategy of someone who understood that the right moment to move was not every moment, and that waiting for the right one was its own form of courage. But she was done minimizing now. The scars on her right arm and across her shoulder were visible today. She'd worn a long-sleeve shirt but rolled the sleeve to the elbow at some point in the morning and hadn't rolled it back. She looked at them in the October light, which was not the angle of light that made things beautiful, just the angle that showed them as they were. They were not beautiful. They were scar tissue, discolored, slightly irregular, changed in texture by the years. They were also, factually, the record of a night when she had moved through heat that should have stopped her and had not stopped her, carrying people who were not able to carry themselves and gotten to the other side. That was what they said, in the language of the body that didn't require interpretation. She was not grateful for the burns. She was not glad they had happened. She didn't think suffering was supposed to be meaningful in any automatic sense. and she had always found something slightly false about the idea that difficult things were gifts. They were not gifts. They were difficult things. What you did with them afterward was yours. What she had done with them, eventually, with enough time and one very specific series of events that began with a German shepherd collapsing in an ambulance bay in the rain, was this. She had stopped carrying them alone. That was all. Not a revelation, not a transformation, just the decision, finally, to let the record be complete. She drove back to Harlow Falls in the late afternoon, the light going gold through the windshield, the valley falling behind her and the city coming back into view. She stopped at a grocery store. She made dinner. She called her sister in Roanoke and talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, which was more nothing in particular than she'd managed in years. Before she went to sleep, she opened the folder on her desk, the one she'd started for letters from veteran patients, and she added the text Reeves had sent her that afternoon with a photograph attached, the last photograph taken of Atlas, which showed him asleep on the mat in the morning light, peaceful in the specific way of an animal at the end of a good life, gray along the muzzle and still. She wrote a note in the margin of the photograph printout, in her own handwriting, because some things were worth having in a form that required a hand and a pen and a moment of deliberate choice. She wrote, "He found me. And then he stayed until he was sure I knew I'd been found." She closed the folder. She turned off the light. Outside, Harlow Falls was doing what cities do. Continuing, indifferent, and alive, the traffic moving and the hospital lit up across the valley with its emergency bay lights and its overnight staff and its new intake protocol, running its first full winter, catching the things that needed catching, routing the complaints to the people with no conflict of interest, training the nurses who would train the next nurses who would know, because someone had made sure they would know, how to look at a veteran patient and understand what they were looking at. That was not everything. Claire knew it was not everything. The system was large and broken in more places than one story could fix. And there would be other physicians with override codes and other committees whose chairs had conflicts they didn't disclose, and other nurses told to remove themselves from cases they should have stayed on. That was the nature of institutions. They were made of people, and people were imperfect in ways that recurred. But this building, this department, this specific set of patients who walked through these specific doors, that part was different now. Not perfect. Different. She had made it different. Not alone. With Priya, who was terrified and did it anyway, and Deb, who had watched for too long and finally said enough, and Wick, who had recognized the way she moved, and Solis, who had sat in a diner booth and listened for 90 minutes, and Jenna Watts in Pittsburgh, who didn't want money, and Dario Fuentes in New Mexico, who wanted her to see what home looked like, and a colonel who was wrong about the paperwork and admitted it, and 7 people who filed statements that sat in a classified folder for 11 years because they wanted the record to be complete, and Atlas, who had simply known where he was supposed to be and gone there. There were people in the world who would look at what Claire Navarro had survived and say she was exceptional. She understood why they said it, and she also understood that it was the wrong frame. She was not exceptional. She was a person who had a specific set of skills and a specific amount of stubbornness, and had found herself in circumstances that required both. The exceptional part, if there was one, was not the extraction or the scars or the deposition or the program proposal. It was the years in between, the ordinary years, when she got up every morning and went to a building where a man spent considerable energy making her feel like less than she was, and she went anyway, and she kept her documentation, and she waited. The waiting was the hard part, not the fire. Anyone who has ever been told they are too small for the space they're standing in knows that the hardest thing is not the dramatic moment of resistance. The hardest thing is the 1,000 unremarkable mornings before it, when you get up and put your scrubs on and go back in. Not because you've been vindicated, not because anyone has seen you clearly yet, but because you know what you know and you're not willing to let someone else's assessment of your worth become your own. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. Claire Navarro had been called just a nurse by a man who needed her to be less than she was so that he could be more than he deserved. She had let that sentence live in the building for 3 years. She had carried it out the door in the rain the night he tried to make it permanent. And then she had gone back, not to prove anything to him, not even entirely for herself, for the veteran in the intake bay who needed someone to look at them and know what they were looking at, for the nurse who would come after her and need the complaint routing to go somewhere honest, for Jenna Watts, and for the two nurses who had disappeared quietly before her, and for every person in every institution where the structure was built to protect the person at the top instead of the patient at the bottom. She went back for the same reason she had moved through the fire 11 years earlier, because she was the person there, and she knew how, and someone had to. She slept well that night, for the first time in a long time without qualification. Not because everything was resolved, nothing was ever entirely resolved, but because she had stopped waiting for resolution to feel like enough. The work was enough. The record was complete. The people she had carried were still here, living their lives in New Mexico and Pittsburgh and Harlow Falls, and she knew it now. And that knowledge was not a burden. It was the thing she hadn't known she'd been waiting for. It was enough to stand on.